Come in, friend. Fire's warm, rain still falling on the tin roof. Do me a small kindness, hit that subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I read everyone. Now settle in. Close your eyes if you need to. Here we go. Story 1. This one came in a letter I received back in '73, though the events themselves happened in '93, which will make sense in a minute if you're patient with me. Now listen close. This is how it happened, best as I can tell it. His name was Elias Trumbo, 41 years old, mail carrier out of a little town in eastern Iowa called Millport, population 1,200 and change. It was a Tuesday evening in October of '93, 6:47 in the evening by the clock on his kitchen wall, and the rain had been falling for 9 straight days. That last detail matters. 9 days of rain in a place that gets 40 inches a year is the kind of thing folks talk about at the diner. Elias had walked his route in it every single one of those days, and by that Tuesday evening his boots were so soaked through that the leather had gone soft as an old dish rag. Now Elias was not a man given to imagination. He was the sort of fella who kept a spiral notebook in his shirt pocket, and in that notebook he wrote down the number of pieces of mail he delivered each day, the temperature at 6 in the morning, and the license plate of any car he did not recognize on his route. He'd been doing that for 19 years. His wife had passed in '91. Cancer took her over the course of 18 months, and since then Elias had lived alone in the little clapboard farmhouse his grandfather built in 1906 out on County Road E, about 4 miles from town. The house had 2 bedrooms upstairs, a parlor, a kitchen, and a root cellar accessed through a hatch in the pantry floor. That root cellar is going to matter later, so keep it in the back of your mind. That Tuesday evening, Elias came home from his route just like any other day. He hung his rain slicker on the hook by the door, set his lunch pail on the counter, and put a kettle on for tea. He was a tea drinker, not a coffee man, which was unusual for a mail carrier in that part of the country. He liked it strong, with 2 sugars, no milk. While the kettle warmed, he thumbed through the day's mail that had come to his own box, sorting it into 2 piles. Bills on the left, personal on the right. There wasn't much personal these days. A cousin in Dubuque who sent a Christmas card, and every so often something from the Veterans Association, though Elias had never served. He didn't know why they had his address at the bottom of the pile that Tuesday was a manila envelope, 9 inches by 12. No return address, no postmark. His own name and address were written on the front in a hand he did not recognize, in blue fountain pen ink, the letters carefully formed, almost like calligraphy. Now here's the strange part, and this was the first strange thing Elias noticed. The envelope had come through the mail. It was in his personal box out at the end of the drive, but there was no postmark on it, no stamp, no cancellation mark. And Elias, being a mail carrier for 19 years, knew for a fact that he had not delivered it that morning. He'd sorted his own mail before leaving the post office, same as always. There had been no manila envelope. He turned it over in his hands twice. He held it up to the yellowed kitchen light. He could feel something inside it, thin, flat, maybe a booklet of some kind. He set it down on the table, poured his tea, and opened the envelope with a butter knife along the top edge. Inside was a small leather-bound book about the size of a checkbook ledger, brown leather, worn smooth at the corners, no writing on the cover. He opened it. The first page was blank. So was the second. So was the third. He flipped through the whole thing, and every single page in the little book was blank. 64 pages of empty cream-colored paper. No name, no date, no note, nothing. Just an empty ledger delivered to his house without a stamp. Elias, being the practical man he was, figured somebody had made a mistake. Maybe it was meant for the Trumbo place 2 counties over, some distant relation. Maybe it was junk mail, some strange promotional item. He set the ledger on the kitchen table next to the salt shaker, drank his tea, ate a bowl of chicken noodle soup from a can, and went to bed at 9:15, same as every night. He woke at 2:41 in the morning. He knew that because the wind-up clock on his nightstand made a particular little tick right at the top of every minute, and he'd been laying there awake for a couple minutes before he thought to look at it. Something had woken him. He could not say what. The rain was still falling, softer now, more of a mist against the window pane, and the house was quiet, the way old farmhouses are quiet, which is to say full of small settling sounds that you learn to ignore. But something had woken him. He lay there for a while, listening. Then he got up, pulled on his robe and his slippers, and went downstairs. He didn't turn on the overhead light. He never did at night. His eyes were used to the dark, and the moon through the kitchen window was enough to see by. He went to the kitchen, thinking he'd get a glass of water. The ledger was open on the table. It had been closed when he went to bed. He was certain of it. He had closed it himself, set it down flat, next to the salt shaker. Now it lay open, and on the first page, in the same blue fountain pen ink as the envelope, in the same careful calligraphic hand, someone had written a single line. He picked up the ledger and carried it to the window to read it by the moonlight. The line said, Mrs. Adele Corbin, hours 47. That was all. Elias stared at that line for a long time. Adele Corbin was a woman on his mail route. She lived in a little bungalow on Sycamore Street in town. She was somewhere around 70 years old, a widow, kept a garden of roses, and delivered zucchini bread to her neighbors in August. Elias delivered her Social Security check on the 3rd of every month, and a magazine called Bird and Blossom, which she subscribed to. He liked her. She always waved from her porch. Owes 47 what? Dollars? Days? Elias turned the page. The second page was blank. He turned back to the first page. The line was still there. He closed the book. He opened it. The line was still there. He set it down on the table, went to the sink, poured himself a glass of water, and drank it standing up. Then he took the ledger, put it back in the manila envelope, put the envelope in the drawer under the silverware, and went back to bed. He did not sleep well. The next morning was a Wednesday. Elias got up at 4:45, same as always, made his oatmeal, drank his tea, put on his uniform and his rain slicker, because it was still raining, the 10th day now, and drove into town to the post office. He sorted his route. He loaded his satchel. He walked his walk. And when he came to Adele Corbin's little bungalow on Sycamore Street, there was no Adele Corbin on the porch to wave. The house was dark. The blinds were drawn. The mail from the previous day was still in the box, which was unusual. Adele always brought her mail in by noon. She was particular about that. Elias put her new mail on top of the old, latched the box, and stood there a moment on the sidewalk, looking at the house. Something felt wrong. He walked up to the porch. He knocked, he waited. He knocked again, and that's when he noticed the smell. It wasn't strong. It was the faintest whisper of something iron and sweet drifting out from under the front door, mixed with the smell of wet earth from the garden. Elias was a mail carrier, not a policeman, but he'd been alive long enough to know what that smell was. He walked back to his truck and radioed the sheriff. Adele Corbin was dead. She'd been dead, the coroner would say later, for about 47 hours. Her heart had given out on Monday morning at approximately 11:15. She'd been sitting in her wingback chair by the front window, a cup of tea gone cold on the little table next to her, an open book of crossword puzzles on her lap. No sign of forced entry, no sign of struggle. Just an old woman who'd stopped living quietly and never got up again. 47 hours. Elias remembered that number. He drove home that evening with a coldness in the pit of his stomach that had nothing to do with the rain. He didn't eat supper. He went straight to the drawer under the silverware, took out the ledger, and opened it to the first page. The line about Mrs. Adele Corbin was still there, but it had been added to. In the same blue ink, in the same careful hand, someone had written underneath it, "Paid," and a small mark next to it, like a check mark, only sharper, almost like a claw. Elias closed the book. He sat down at the kitchen table and did not move for a long time. He was not a man who believed in things he could not see. He was a mail carrier who wrote down license plates in a spiral notebook. But he was also a man who had lost his wife slowly and who had watched her go and who understood in his bones that there are more things in this world than a fella can account for. He understood, sitting there at that kitchen table with the rain falling outside and the 10th day of it drawing toward evening, that something had come to his house. Something had brought this book, and something wanted him to read it. He opened the ledger again. He turned to the second page. There was a new line in the same handwriting. It said, "Mr. Harold Weekes, hours 12." Now, Harold Weekes was a farmer on Elias's route, a man in his late 60s who raised soybeans and complained about the weather. He was also, as far as Elias knew, in perfect health. He had waved at Elias just that morning from his tractor. Elias stared at the line for a long time. 12. 12. What? He waited. He watched the page. Nothing more appeared. He closed the book, put it back in the drawer, and this time he went and got a bottle of whiskey down from the cabinet above the refrigerator. A bottle he'd kept there since his wife's funeral, unopened. He poured himself 2 fingers of it and drank it slow. Then he went to bed. That night he did not wake in the middle of the night, but he dreamed. He dreamed he was walking his mail route. Only the houses on the route were empty, and the doors were all standing open. And behind each open door was a room he'd never seen before. And in each room there was a person he knew sitting very still, not looking at him. He dreamed he was walking and walking, and the route did not end, and the rain would not stop, and behind him, at some distance he could not quite measure, something was counting. He woke at 5 in the morning. 12 hours later, at 5 in the evening on Thursday, Harold Weekes was found dead in his soybean field. His tractor had rolled. The coroner would say later that he'd been thrown clear, that his neck had broke, that he'd died more or less instantly. It was, everyone said, a tragic accident. 12 hours. Elias came home that night and opened the ledger. The line about Harold Weekes had been added to, "Paid," and the little sharp mark next to it. He turned the page. The third line was there already. He hadn't even had to wait. In the same blue ink, in the same careful hand, it said, "Miss Cora Bellwood." Ouse 3. Cora Bellwood was the 6-year-old daughter of the family that lived at the end of Elias's route. She wore pigtails. She had a little dog named Biscuit. She once gave Elias a drawing of a mailman with a big smile and a heart drawn over his head. Elias remembered that drawing. He had it pinned to the corkboard in his kitchen. He could see it from where he sat. 3. What? Elias did something then that he had never done in 19 years of mail carrying. He drove into town that night, in the rain, in the dark, and he parked his truck across the street from the Bellwood house, and he sat there until sunrise. He watched every window. He watched every shadow. Nothing happened. Cora Bellwood came out of the house at 7:30 in the morning with her lunchbox, waving at the school bus. She was alive. She was fine. 3 hours. He drove home. He did not sleep. At 10:30 that morning, the school called the Bellwood house. The bus had been in an accident on County Road K. A logging truck had come around a curve too fast. 3 children had been hurt. One of them, a little girl in pigtails, had not survived. Elias sat on his porch that afternoon in the rain, and he did not go to work. He called in sick. He had not called in sick in 9 years. He sat on the porch, and he watched the rain fall on the wet grass, and he thought about the little drawing pinned to his corkboard. That evening he went inside, and he opened the ledger. Paid. The little sharp mark. He turned the page. There was no new line yet. The page was blank. He sat down at the kitchen table, and he waited. He waited for hours. He drank tea, and then he drank whiskey, and then he drank water, and he waited. And around 10:45 that night, as he sat there watching the empty page, the blue ink began to appear. He watched it happen. He watched the pen strokes form without a hand. He watched a line write itself across the page, the way frost creeps across a window pane, slow and inevitable. The line took nearly a full minute to complete. He did not look away. The line said, Mr. Elias Trumbo, Ouse, and then it stopped. The ink hesitated. The pen, the invisible pen, hovered, waiting on something. Elias stared at the words, his own name, his own address on the second line, and after the word O's, a blankness that was waiting to be filled. He understood, then, in a way he could not have explained to another living soul, that the ledger was asking him a question. It was asking him what he was willing to owe. He closed the book. He carried it into the pantry. He lifted the hatch in the pantry floor, and he climbed down the wooden steps into the root cellar, where his grandfather had kept jars of pickled beets and shelves of canned pears back in the 1920s. The cellar was dry, dirt floor, smelled of old wood and cool earth. In the far corner, behind a shelf, there was a loose stone in the foundation. Elias had known about it since he was a boy. He'd hidden marbles there when he was 8. He pulled out the stone. Behind it was a small hollow. He put the ledger in the hollow. He put the stone back. He climbed out of the cellar and shut the hatch and put a heavy sack of flour on top of it. Then he went upstairs and he went to bed. He slept. God help him, he slept. He slept for what he thought was one night, but when he woke, the light through the window was strange. Too bright, too dry. He got up, went to the window, and looked out. The rain had stopped. The ground was dry. The trees looked different, fuller, greener, the way they look in June instead of October. He went downstairs. The calendar on the kitchen wall said June. His spiral notebook on the table where he left it was full of entries in his own handwriting that he did not remember making. 8 months of entries. He read them, page by page. His route, his deliveries, his temperatures at 6 a.m. It was all there, all in his hand, all normal. He went into the pantry. The sack of flour was still on the hatch. He moved it. He lifted the hatch. He went down into the cellar. He went to the far corner. He pulled out the loose stone. The hollow was empty. He sat down on the dirt floor of his grandfather's root cellar, and he understood a great many things all at once. He understood that 8 months had passed, and he had lived them, and he did not remember them. He understood that something had walked him through those 8 months, doing his job, sorting his mail, waving at his neighbors, wearing his skin. He understood that the ledger was gone because it did not need to be there anymore. He was the ledger now. He had agreed to something in his sleep, and he had been paying on it day by day for 8 months, and he did not know how much longer he had left to pay. He did not, that first morning after the 8 lost months, drive straight into town. He sat for a long while at the kitchen table with his hands folded in front of him, looking at the notebook he could not remember writing in. The entries were in blue ballpoint. His usual pen was a black ballpoint. He kept the black one clipped inside his shirt pocket. The blue one was nowhere in the house that he could see. He checked the drawer where he kept his pens. There were 3 of them, all black. He checked the pen cup by the telephone. 2 more, both black. He checked the pockets of his coat. Nothing. Whoever had done his writing for 8 months had brought their own pen. He drove to town. He drove slow. The road was familiar, in the way a room in a dream is familiar. Every mailbox where it ought to be, every bend of the county road exactly the same, but something off in the light, something off in the color of the sky. It was full summer, and it had been full autumn when he laid down to sleep. His mind kept slipping off the edge of that fact, the way a hand slips off the edge of a wet railing. He went into the post office. The other carriers waved. Betty at the sorting table said, "Morning, Elias, you sleep all right?" He said he had. She said, "You've been looking peaked the last couple weeks. Maybe take a Saturday." He said he might. He watched her face for any small tell. She showed him nothing. She looked at him the way she had looked at him for 19 years, warm and bored, and she went back to her mail. He sorted his route. His hands did it without his asking them to. He did not have to think about which houses got magazines on Wednesdays and which houses got the little brown envelopes from the state. His hands knew, and that told him something he did not want to know. His hands had been doing this route the whole time. They had learned patterns he had not learned. Somewhere in his fingers, in the small muscle memory that lives below thinking, there were 8 months of practice he did not own. He walked his route. Everyone waved. Everyone knew his name. A boy on a bicycle rode past him and called out, "Hey, Mr. Trumbo," and grinned like a boy grins at a man he trusts. Elias did not know the boy. He said hello anyway. He watched the boy pedal away down the shady side of the street. At the Bellwood house, at the end of the route, he stopped. There was a new mailbox, painted white. The old one had been dark green. He remembered the dark green one because Cora, the little girl, had helped her father paint it one Saturday 2 summers back and had gotten green paint in her hair. This new mailbox had letters on the side, in neat black paint. It said Bellwood, and underneath that, smaller, "In memory of Cora." Elias stood at the mailbox a long minute. He put the mail in. He walked back to his truck. He drove home. That night, he checked the cellar. The stone in the far corner was still loose. The hollow behind it was still empty. But when he stood there with his lamp lifted, he noticed a thing he had not noticed before. On the dirt floor of the cellar, in a wide circle around where he was standing, the earth had been disturbed, not dug, just walked on, many, many times. There were faint patterns in the dust, faint enough that only a man who had lived in a house for 60 years would have seen them. Small tracks, the size of a man's shoe. Only there were too many of them in too many directions, as if somebody had paced that circle for a very long time. Hundreds of nights, maybe more. Elias climbed out of the cellar. He put the sack of flour back on the hatch. He did not go down there again for a long time. The days that followed were quiet. He worked his route. He came home. He made his tea. He sat at the kitchen table, and he waited for something to happen, and nothing did. He began to think, cautiously, that perhaps whatever had been oozing him was done, that the 8 months had been the payment, and now the debt was clear. He allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, to sleep with the bedroom light off. He should not have. On the 14th night after he woke into summer, Elias came home from his route and found a manila envelope on the kitchen table, 9 inches by 12. No return address, no postmark, his own name and address on the front in blue fountain pen ink. The letters carefully formed, almost like calligraphy. He did not open it, not that night. He carried it out to the burn barrel at the edge of his yard, and he doused it with kerosene, and he lit it with a match. He watched it burn. The paper curled and blackened and fell into the barrel in flakes. When it was done, he went back inside. He locked the door. He went to bed. He woke at 2:41 in the morning. He knew it was 2:41 because his wind-up clock made its particular little tick at the top of every minute, and he had been laying awake for 2 of those ticks. Something had woken him. He got up. He went downstairs. He did not turn on the overhead light. On the kitchen table was a manila envelope, 9 inches by 12, no return address, no postmark, his own name and address on the front in blue fountain pen ink. Elias sat down in his chair at the kitchen table. He looked at the envelope. He looked at the drawer under the silverware. He looked at his own hands. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, calm and still, and they did not look like the hands of a man who was afraid. That was the moment, he told me later, when he understood the true shape of the thing. It was not a debt he had taken on. It was a debt he had been born into. The ledger had not come to him. It had come back to him. His grandfather, who had built this house in 1906, had he sat at this same table on a rainy October night and opened a manila envelope? His father, who had died in that upstairs bedroom in 1959, had he too laid down and slept and woke into a summer he did not remember? Elias understood, sitting there, that the loose stone in the cellar had been loose since before he was born, that the marbles he had hidden there as a boy had been hidden in a place already used. He had thought all his life that the hollow was his secret. It had been nobody's secret. It had been the family's mailbox all along. He opened the envelope. Inside was the little leather-bound ledger. Brown leather, worn smooth at the corners. He opened it. Every page was blank. He got up. He fetched the blue ballpoint pen. He did not have to look for it. He knew now where it was. It was in the little drawer beside the stove, tucked behind a box of matches. He had put it there sometime in the 8 months he did not remember. He took it out. He came back to the table. He sat down. He opened the ledger to the first page. He picked up the pen. He hesitated a long moment. Then he wrote, in his own careful hand, a single line. He wrote, "I would like to know what I owe." He closed the book. He set the pen on top of it. He put out the kitchen light. He went upstairs. He lay down on his bed. He listened to the rain on the roof. For the rain had come back, sometime while he was not looking, and was falling now soft and steady on the tin, and he waited to see if he would sleep. He did not know, that night, whether the answer would come as a line of writing, or as another 8 months lost, or as something else altogether. He only knew that he had asked, plain, and that whatever answered him would be his to carry. He slept. He dreamed of a long line of Trumbos, standing in a row, each one holding a small leather book, each one turning the page for the next. When he woke in the morning, the rain had stopped. The ledger was on the kitchen table. It was open to the first page. His question was still there in his own hand, and underneath it, in the blue ink he now knew was the same blue as the pen in the drawer, in a hand that was his hand and not his hand at the same time, was a single line. The line said, "More than one lifetime, Elias, but not more than the family has to give." He closed the book. He carried it to the cellar. He put it in the hollow behind the loose stone. He set the stone back. He climbed out. He put the sack of flour on the hatch. He went to work. He climbed out of the cellar. He went upstairs. He got his uniform on. He drove into town. He sorted his route. He walked his walk. Every person on his route waved at him, called him by name. Everyone knew him. Everyone had been seeing him every day for 8 months. He walked his route slow that day. He took his time at every mailbox. He looked at the houses. He looked at the yards. He was trying to see what had changed in 8 months and what had not. Small things had changed. A house on Elm Street had been painted. A new fence was up at the Peterson place. Old Miss Kettering's rose bushes had been pulled up and replaced with a strip of gravel and a plaster deer. The little things a mail carrier notices. When a mail carrier is paying attention, he noted them in his head as he walked. He did not write them down. He noticed something else, too, something harder to name. At about half the houses on his route, when he came up to the box, he would feel a small pause, a hesitation, like his hand knew something his mind did not, as if his hand had, at some point during those lost 8 months, done something at that box that had left a small residue. He did not know what. He did not want to know. But at 3 houses in particular, the McAllister place, the little rented duplex on Willow, and a farm out on the county road that he did not remember ever being on his route, his hand did not want to open the box. He opened them anyway. He put the mail in. He walked on. At the Bellwood house at the end of the day, he stood at the new mailbox, the white one, the memorial one, with the little painted letters that spelled Cora's name, and he took off his cap. He held it against his chest. He did not know what he wanted to say. He said, in a voice so quiet the wind almost took it, "I am sorry, honey. I am sorry I could not sit longer." The wind did take it then. It moved off across the yard and into the trees, and Cora's parents' curtains stirred in an open window on the 2nd floor, and somewhere inside the house a radio was playing a song from the 60s. Elias put his cap back on. He put the mail in the box. He walked back to his truck. He drove home. The rain had started to spatter again on the windshield. He thought, driving out of town, about all the things a person owes, and all the things a person does not know they owe, and how the difference between the two is sometimes only who is keeping the books. That evening he came home. He made his tea. He sat at the kitchen table. He opened the drawer under the silverware just to see. It was empty. He closed it. He drank his tea. Then he took out his spiral notebook, and he turned to a fresh page, and he began to write. He wrote the date. He wrote the temperature. He wrote the number of pieces of mail he had delivered, and underneath all of that, in his own careful hand, he wrote a single line. The line said, Mr. Elias Trumbo. Still O's, and then he closed the notebook, and he set it on the table next to the salt shaker, and he waited to see what would answer him. The rain that night began to fall again. Just a soft one at first, the kind that taps against the tin roof, gentle, patient, like somebody counting. Somewhere in the house, from a room Elias could not identify, a page turned, just one page, very softly, and Elias, sitting at his kitchen table with his cold tea and his empty notebook, closed his eyes, and he did not open them again for a long, long time. Story 2. A woman told me this in Charleston when I was still working the mail route, though she'd lived it out west, in Oregon, some years earlier. She told it slow, and she told it careful, and I've carried it with me ever since. Now listen close. This is how she said it happened. Her name was Margaret Vance. Most folks called her Maggie. She was 36 years old, a land surveyor by trade, employed by a small firm out of Eugene that took contracts from timber companies and county governments and the occasional private landowner. It was the third week of April in 2019, a Wednesday afternoon, and Maggie was driving a company pickup along a logging road on the west slope of the Cascade Mountains, some 47 miles from the nearest town, headed to a parcel of land that her firm had been hired to walk. The parcel was old-growth timber, roughly 200 acres, and the timber company that owned it wanted new boundary stakes set before they moved the crews in that summer. Maggie had done this kind of job 100 times. She had her instruments in the back of the truck, total station, tripod, prisms, a handheld GPS, spray paint flags in 3 colors, and she had her lunch in a cooler on the passenger seat, a thermos of coffee, and a topographic map spread across the dashboard. The rain had been misting all morning. That's the way it does out on the west slope in April. Not a heavy rain, just a fine gray drizzle that never quite stops and never quite starts either. The kind of rain that soaks a person slow without them noticing until they realize their shirt is wet all the way through. Maggie had a good rain jacket in the truck. She'd been out there long enough to know how to dress. She reached the parcel around 2 in the afternoon. There was a small pull-off at the end of the logging road, a clearing just big enough to turn a truck around in, and beyond the clearing, the trees rose up in the way that old-growth Douglas fir rises up, dark and tall, and so close together that the light between them was the color of tea. She parked. She got out. She stretched. She noted the time in her field book. 2:07 p.m., April 17th, 2019. She loaded her pack, shouldered the tripod, and started into the trees. Now the parcel had a stream running through the middle of it, north to south, and Maggie's plan was to work her way to the stream first, set a benchmark, and then walk the boundaries from there. The topographic map showed the stream at about a quarter-mile in from the road on a gentle downslope. That's about 400 yards. In flat country with a clear trail, that's a 5-minute walk. In old-growth timber on a wet slope with a pack, It's maybe 15 or 20 minutes. Maggie had allowed herself half an hour to be safe. She walked. The trees closed in around her. The light dropped. The ground was soft with fir needles, dark as coffee grounds, and the air had that clean, cold smell of moss and rain and the deep green thing that grows underneath old timber. She checked her GPS every couple of minutes. Everything was normal. At the 20-minute mark, she had not reached the stream. That was not immediately alarming. Timber can be slow to cross. Downed logs, brush, the occasional deer trail that leads you 100 feet the wrong way. She checked her GPS. The GPS said she was 180 yards from the stream. She kept walking. At the 40-minute mark, she had not reached the stream. She stopped. She checked the GPS again. The GPS said she was 179 yards from the stream. She stared at it. She had been walking, by her count, for another 20 minutes. She had been walking downslope in a straight line, watching her compass. She had covered no ground, she thought, at first, that the GPS was malfunctioning. It happens. Under heavy canopy, the satellite signals get bounced around. She shook the unit. She waited for it to reacquire. It said the same thing, 179 yards. She stood there for a minute, listening. There is a particular sound the old growth makes when it's quiet, and I want you to understand that it is not a silence. It is more like a hum, deep and low, made of 100 small things happening at once. Water dripping from needles, small movements in the moss, wind so high in the crowns of the trees that you can only just hear it. That hum was there. But underneath it, Maggie noticed, there was something else, kind of second sound, a softer sound, almost like footsteps, slow ones, well behind her or maybe just off to her right. She could not tell. She turned around. She walked back toward the truck. She walked for what felt like 10 minutes. She did not reach the truck. She checked her GPS. The GPS said she was now 340 yards from the truck and 180 yards from the stream. She was farther from both than when she'd started. Maggie was not a woman who panicked easily. She had gotten lost before. She had spent a night in the woods once, in Montana, when she was 28, and she had come out of it fine. She sat down on a log. She drank some water. She ate a granola bar. She checked her compass against the GPS. The compass agreed with the GPS on direction, but the distances weren't making sense. She decided to count her steps. She would walk exactly 100 paces due east, back toward where the truck should be. She would count every step, and then she would check the GPS. She stood up, took a bearing, and began to walk. 1, 2, 3, she walked steady. She was a tall woman, long-legged, and her stride was about a yard, so 100 paces should have been about 100 yards. She walked and she counted, and she watched the ground. 40, 41, 42. On step 42, she stopped. She had not intended to stop, but something about that number made her stop. She was standing in a small opening between two enormous Douglas firs, and the light was gray, and the moss on the north sides of the trees was thick as a mattress, and the ground where she stood was covered in a low green plant with heart-shaped leaves. Wood sorrel, she thought. Though she didn't know why she was thinking about the plant. She had stopped on step 42 because something in her body had told her to. She looked around. She listened. The second sound was closer now. The footsteps, if that's what they were, they had also stopped. When she had stopped, they had stopped. She stood very still. She counted to 30 in her head. Nothing moved. Then she took one more step. She heard distinctly one soft step behind her. She turned around. She turned all the way around, slowly 360 degrees. There was nothing there. Just the trees, just the moss, just the gray light and the mist. She looked at her GPS. The GPS said she was 42 yards from where she had sat down on the log, which was correct, which was the first thing that had made sense in almost an hour. She thought, then, very calmly, that she needed to try something. She took her survey tape out of her pack. It was 100-foot fiberglass tape on a reel. She hooked one end of it to a low branch on the fir beside her, and she began to walk again, unspooling the tape behind her, back toward where she thought the truck was. She walked 42 steps. The tape ran out at 42 steps, which meant she had walked, in real physical distance, about 42 yards, which meant her strides were still a yard long, which meant her count was accurate, which meant the GPS, when it agreed with her count, was accurate too. She unhooked the tape. She hooked it to a branch there. She kept walking, reeling out a new 100 feet. She walked another 42 steps, and on step 42 she stopped. She had not intended to stop, but something in her body had told her to. She looked at the tape. It had run out again. She looked around. She was standing in a small opening between two enormous Douglas firs, and the light was gray, and there was moss on the north sides of the trees, and the ground was covered in wood sorrel. It was the same clearing. She looked back the way she had come. The tape ran back through the trees, taut and straight, for 100 feet, and hooked to a branch. She could see the branch. She had just been standing there. She walked back to the branch. She stood beside it. She looked forward, the way she had just walked. She could see the tape stretching out in front of her. And at the far end of it, 100 feet away, another branch, in another clearing, that looked exactly the same. She walked forward again. 42 steps. She arrived at the far branch. She looked back. She could see the branch she had just come from 100 feet away, in the trees. She could see the tape connecting them. She walked back 42 steps. She arrived at the near branch. She looked back the way she'd come. The far branch, 100 feet through the trees. The distances were real. The clearing was real. But every 42 steps, she was arriving in what looked like the same clearing. Maggie sat down again on the fir needles. She took a long, slow breath. She was not lost. She was something worse than lost. She had walked into a place where the ground was doing something the ground was not supposed to do. She thought about the footsteps. They had stopped when she stopped. They had walked when she walked. And now that she was sitting very still, she noticed a small sound, quieter than a footstep. It was a sound like breathing. Not close, not far, somewhere out among the trees, in and out, very slow. She got up. She left the tape where it was. She took her spray paint flags out of her pack, bright orange ones. She started walking again, and every few steps she stuck a flag in the ground. She counted her steps. She was going to leave a trail this time, something physical, something that could not be undone by whatever the trees were doing. She walked 42 steps. She arrived in the clearing. She turned around. There were no flags behind her. The ground where she had walked was smooth and unbroken, thick with fir needles and wood sorrel. She checked her pack. The remaining flags were still there, but the ones she had stuck in the ground were gone. She stood in the clearing for a long time. I'll tell you what she told me next. She said she stopped trying to leave. She said something in her, some deep part of her that a person usually keeps quiet, said very plainly, "You cannot leave by walking." She said the deep part of her also said, "Sit down," and so she sat down. She sat down on the fir needles in the middle of the clearing, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. She waited a long time, long enough that the gray light began to turn grayer, long enough that she noticed, off in the trees, a shape. It was not close. It was maybe 40 feet out among the firs. It was tall and thin and stood very still, and it had the shape of a person, and it did not have the color of a person. It had the color of the trees. It stood at the edge of what she could see, and it stood exactly 42 feet away, and it did not come closer, and it did not go away. She looked at it. It looked at her. She could feel it looking. She said, and this is the part I remember best, she said she understood, sitting there, that the thing was not trying to hurt her. It was just counting. It had been counting for a long time. Every set of 42 steps she had taken, it had been standing there in the clearing, watching her arrive. She had walked in a circle a dozen times. She had never once left the clearing. The trees had shown her different versions of the same 42 yards. And the thing had stood, and it had counted. She wondered how long it had been counting by. Not hours, not days, longer than that. She had the sudden feeling that if she looked down at her hands, they would be older than they were supposed to be. She did not look down at her hands. Instead, she spoke. She said out loud in a normal voice, "I would like to go now, please." The thing did not move. She said, "I've been here long enough." The thing tilted its head, just slightly, to the side. Like a bird considers a worm, she said, "What do you need me to do?" The thing raised one long arm. It pointed, not at her, past her. She turned her head slowly and looked in the direction it was pointing. It was pointing at the far branch, 100 feet away, where her tape was still hooked. She looked back at the thing. The thing had not moved. Its arm was still pointing. She understood. She got up. She walked to the branch. She walked past it. She kept walking. She counted her steps. She got to 42. She did not stop. She took a 43rd step. She took a 44th. She took a 45th. She heard behind her a sound like every tree in the forest taking one small breath in. She kept walking. She got to 100 steps, then 150, then 200. The trees began to look different. The light began to change. She saw, ahead of her, a break in the timber, and past the break, a strip of gravel, and past the gravel her truck. She walked to it. She got in. She locked the doors. She started the engine. She looked at the clock on the dashboard. It said 2:07. She had been in the trees for 1 minute, by the truck's clock, or she had been in the trees for a lifetime. She was not sure which. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror. Her face was her face. Her hair was her hair. She could not tell if she was older. She could not tell if she was younger. She only knew she was different. She drove back to Eugene. She did not tell her boss what had happened. She got back to Eugene late that night. The rain had followed her down the mountain, softening as she came out of the timber into the foothills, turning at last to a light mist by the time she reached the outskirts of town. She parked the pickup in the company lot. She sat behind the wheel with the engine off and the wipers stopped and the world running with water on the other side of the glass. She sat there for a long time. She was trying to remember how a person got out of a truck. She got out eventually. She walked to her car. She drove home. She lived in a little apartment above a bakery on a side street off Willamette. And when she came up the stairs to her door, the smell of bread from below was so ordinary and so warm that she almost sat down on the landing and cried. She did not. She let herself in. She locked the door behind her. She stood in her own front room, and she looked at her furniture, the couch with the blue throw, the coffee table with the ring from a mug, the bookshelf with her surveying manuals. And she understood, in a way she had not understood before that day, how thin the world is. She did not sleep well for a long time after. The nights were the hardest. She would lie down, and she would close her eyes, and behind her eyelids she would see the small opening between the two Douglas firs, and the wood sorrel on the ground, and the tall, thin-shaped 42 feet out among the trees. She would open her eyes. She would turn on the light. She would read. She would knit. She would do anything to keep her mind from counting. Because her mind wanted to count. It wanted to count her heartbeats. It wanted to count the ticks of the clock. It wanted to count the drops of rain against the window. And whenever her count got up around 35, 36, 37, she would feel that quiet attention gathering somewhere just past the edge of the light, waiting. She learned tricks. She would stop the count at some odd small number, 17 or 23 or 11. She would restart. She never let herself go past 38. She built her days out of numbers that could not, in any combination, add up to 42. She would drink 2 cups of coffee, never 3. She would take 4 steps up a curb, or 5, but never 6 plus any other 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 6 plus 12. She knew, in the part of her that had sat in the clearing, that this was not a proof against the thing. It was a courtesy she was paying herself. A small ritual, the way an old woman touches wood. At the firm, she took desk work. She told them the field work was aggravating an old back injury. They believed her. She was good at maps and calculations, and there was plenty of that kind of work to be had. She sat at a table with a T-square and a set of dividers, and she drew boundaries for other people to walk. She did not miss the outdoors. She was not sure anymore whether the outdoors could be trusted. 2 things happened in the months that followed that I think are worth telling. The first was a letter. It came in the spring of 2020, about 11 months after the day in the timber. The envelope had no return address. The postmark said Salem. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once, and a small photograph. The photograph showed a woman standing at the edge of an old-growth clearing. The trees around her were Douglas firs, enormous and old, and the ground at her feet was covered in wood sorrel. She was standing very still. Her hair was Maggie's hair. Her jacket was Maggie's rain jacket, the same one she'd been wearing that day in April. Her face was Maggie's face. She was looking straight at the camera, and she was smiling a small, tired smile. The photograph was dated on the back, in pencil. It said, April 17, 2019, 2:08 p.m. Maggie stared at the date. She had noted her arrival at the parcel that day at 2:07 p.m. in her field book. This picture was taken 1 minute later, in the clearing she had never left, by somebody who had been standing close enough to take her picture, and who she had never seen. The paper in the envelope had 4 words written on it in careful handwriting she did not know. The words were, "You didn't count right." She sat with the letter a long time that evening. She thought about tearing it up. She thought about burning it. She did neither. She put it in a drawer in her kitchen. She put the photograph in with it. She closed the drawer. She did not open it again for 2 years. The second thing was smaller, but it stayed with her longer. About 18 months after the day in the timber, on a Saturday afternoon in October, Maggie went for a walk in a little city park not far from her apartment. It was a clear day. The leaves were turning. There were children on the playground and a man throwing a frisbee for a golden retriever, and an old couple sitting on a bench feeding bread to the ducks. It was the most ordinary afternoon a person could ask for. She walked around the pond. She was not counting. She had gotten better at not counting. She was thinking about a friend's wedding the next weekend, and about a dress she needed to have altered, and about whether she should bring flowers. She walked, and she thought, and she did not count. Somewhere in the middle of the loop around the pond, she felt something brush the back of her right hand. She looked down. There was nothing there. Her hand was open at her side, empty. She kept walking. A few steps later, she felt it again, a small, cool pressure against the back of her hand, as if somebody was walking beside her and just barely touching her with their own fingers. She stopped. She turned. There was nobody within 30 feet of her. She looked at her hand. Her hand looked like her hand. She could see the small freckle above her knuckle. She could see the small scar from a childhood fall on a bicycle. She flexed her fingers. She felt them flex. Everything was as it should be. She kept walking. The pressure did not come again for the rest of the loop. But when she got back to her car in the parking lot, she looked in the rear-view mirror before she started the engine. She was in the habit of doing that now. She looked, and her own face looked back at her, and behind her, in the reflection, there was nothing, just the parking lot and the trees and the light coming down, slanted through the maples. Then she noticed her own eyes in the mirror, something about the way they were looking back at her. Very still, very patient. Not surprised. She thought, and she told me this on the porch in Charleston, 30 years later, with her lemonade in her hand. She thought, sitting in her car that October afternoon, how long have my eyes been looking at me like that? How long have they been the ones looking and not me? She drove home. She did not walk in the park again. There is one more piece to tell, and then I'll let this one rest. Many years after, many years, after she had retired and moved to Charleston and taken up a garden and a porch and a good routine of doing as little as possible, Maggie was cleaning out a closet, and she found a shoebox she did not remember packing. Inside the shoebox was her field book from 2019, blue cover, waterproof. She sat down on the floor of the closet, and she opened it. The entries were in her own hand. The parcel on the west slope, the readings from the total station, the sketches of the boundaries. She flipped through the pages. She got to April 17th. The entry for 2:07 p.m. was there, in her writing. Arrived parcel. Weather, light mist, starting the walk-in. But underneath it, in the same handwritten, her own, was another entry. Time-stamped 2:08 p.m. It said, "She's here." She sat down like she was told. Good. Maggie sat on the closet floor a long time. She closed the field book. She put it back in the shoebox. She put the shoebox back on the shelf. She did not throw it away. Sometimes, she said, a thing that lives with you is safer where you can see it than where you cannot. She never walked into old-growth timber again. But she made her peace, in a manner of speaking, with the world she had come back into. She said the trick was not to fight the countin'. The trick was to notice that the countin' was there, and to steer around it, gentle-like, the way you steer around a sleeping dog on a porch. Wake it, and it barks. Step around it, and you both keep living. I asked her once if she thought the thing in the clearing was still there. Waiting, counting. She sipped her lemonade. She looked out at her roses. She said quietly, "Everything's still where I left it. That's the trouble with the woods, mister. Nothing ever really leaves." She told him the parcel needed a resurvey, that her GPS had malfunctioned. He believed her. She wrote up a report. She did not go back to that parcel. She did not go back into old-growth timber again, ever, for the rest of her career. But here is the part I want you to hear. Maggie told me, and she was in Charleston by then, retired, on a porch in the sun, drinking lemonade. She told me that every once in a while, when she takes a walk, she'll be counting her steps without meaning to, and she'll get to about 38, and she'll feel something, a small, quiet something, begin to pay attention to her, and she'll stop the count at 38, every time, because she does not want to see, ever again, what happens at 42. She smiled when she said that. It was a small, tired smile, and the porch was warm, and the sun was on the roses, and the world was ordinary. But I looked at her, and I understood, and I have understood ever since, that some folks come out of the trees, and some folks come out of the trees. And the difference between the two, sometimes, is only what you agree not to count. I sat with her a while after she said that. The sun kept on the roses. A little brown wren came down and drank out of a saucer on the porch rail. Maggie watched it. She smiled a small, tired smile that was, by then, the only kind of smile she seemed to have left. After a while, I asked her a question. I asked her, "Did you ever, in all those years, feel it come calling again? Not out in the woods, but here, in the world you came back to." She thought about that a long time. She sipped her lemonade. She looked at the wren. Then she said, "Once, just the once," and not in a way I would call calling, more like a check-in. I asked her to tell me. She said it was on her 60th birthday. She was living, by then, in the little house in Charleston. Her friends had come over that afternoon. 3 women she'd known for years. A nephew and his wife. A neighbor from down the street. They'd had cake in the back garden. They'd sung the little song. They'd left around 9. Maggie had cleaned up the plates, poured herself one more glass of wine, and gone to sit on the porch. She said the porch was quiet. The evening was warm. There were fireflies out over the lawn. She said she was counting the fireflies without meaning to. She said she got to about 29 before she noticed she was counting. She stopped. She took a long drink of her wine. She looked out at the lawn. She said the fireflies had all stopped the same instant when she stopped counting. The whole yard was dark. She said she waited. She said she did not breathe. After maybe half a minute, one firefly lit up. Just one, out at the edge of the lawn near the fence. It hung there in the dark, a small pale green spark. Then, very slowly, it began to move. Not in the flitting way a firefly moves, in a straight line, toward the porch. She said she watched it come. She said it took its time. She said when it got about 3 feet from her, it stopped. It hovered. It hung there in the air at the level of her eyes, a small pale green spark, and she looked at it, and it looked at her, as much as a firefly can be said to look at a person, and then it went out. She said the whole yard came back on, then. fireflies everywhere. 50, 60 of them, blinking the way. Fireflies blink, careless and beautiful. She said she did not count them. She said she has not counted anything since. Not on purpose. Sometimes a number crosses her mind the way numbers do, and she lets it cross. And she does not chase it. She said it is easier that way. She said it is a small thing to give up when a person considers what she got back in exchange. We sat there a while longer. The wren drank. The sun moved. After a bit, I got up. I thanked her for the lemonade. I thanked her for the telling. She said at the door, "Old man, if you tell this story, tell it slow. Tell it so folks can hear it. There are more people in the woods than most folks know." Said I would. I have tried in the telling just now to keep my end of that promise. I have told it as slow as I could. I have told it as careful. I have not, I hope, added anything that was not hers to add. And if you are listening tonight, friend, and you find yourself later in some quiet moment catching the edge of a count, a heartbeat, a raindrop, footstep on a floor, I would ask you to do something small for Maggie. Stop the count at any odd number that pleases you. 9, 17, 23. Say the number once in your head and then let it go. That's all. That's all she ever asked. That's what has kept her all these years on the porch and not in the woods. Story 3. I lived this one myself. Or I think I did. My memory isn't what it was, and it may be that the man in this story was somebody else and I only heard tell of it. Either way, it happened to somebody, and it happened the way I'm about to tell it. And the truth of a story doesn't always sit in whose feet did the walking. Now listen close. His name was Ronald Kestrel. Everybody called him Ronnie. He was 39 years old in the spring of 1956, and he made his living as a traveling salesman for a company out of Kansas City that sold agricultural insurance to small farmers across the plains. It was a hard job in a hard time. He drove a two-tone Chevy Bel Air, blue on the bottom and white on the top, and he kept his sample cases in the back seat, and he kept his suit hanging on a hook above the rear window. He wore a gray felt hat with a black band. He smoked Lucky Strikes, one after another, and he drank coffee black. It was the end of March, a Thursday evening, and Ronnie was somewhere in the Texas Panhandle on a two-lane blacktop between Amarillo and a little town called Boisville when the sun went down and the wind came up, and he realized he was not going to make Boisville by nightfall. The wind out there in the Panhandle is a thing you have to live through to understand. It comes off the plains and it doesn't stop. It rocks a car on its springs. It scrapes the paint off the sides of barns. It fills the ditches with tumbleweeds, and it fills a man's head with a kind of low, endless whistle that gets under the skin. Ronnie had been driving since 7 that morning. He was tired. His eyes were burning from the road. He'd sold 2 policies that day, one to a wheat farmer, one to a cattleman. And he was proud of the wheat farmer, who had been a hard sell, and he was tired of the cattleman, who had haggled him down almost to nothing. He wanted a hot meal and a bed. He was still 30 miles out from Boisville, and the light was gone. He came around a long, slow curve in the road, and he saw off to the right a little cluster of lights, a neon sign, red and blue, buzzing against the dark. He slowed. He read the sign as he approached. It said Diamond Motorcourt. Underneath, in smaller letters, Calf Vacancy. He pulled off the road. The Diamond was one of those old Panhandle motor courts you don't see much anymore. A row of 6 little stucco cabins, whitewashed with green doors, arranged in an L shape around a gravel parking lot. At the front of the L was a slightly larger building, also stucco, with a sign that said office and another sign that said cafe. The lights were on in the cafe. 2 other cars were parked in the lot, a dusty pickup and a black sedan Ronnie parked. He got out. The wind hit him in the face, and he put his hand on his hat. He walked into the cafe. Inside was warmer than he'd expected. The cafe was small, 6 stools at a counter, 3 booths along the front window, a jukebox in the corner playing Patsy Cline low. Behind the counter was a woman about 60 years old, gray hair pinned up, apron over a blue dress, pouring coffee for a man on one of the stools. The man on the stool wore a suit. The suit was gray. The man's hat sat on the counter next to him. The hat was gray felt with a black band. Ronnie sat down 2 stools away. He nodded at the man. The man nodded back. Ronnie did not look at the man's face too closely. He was tired. The woman poured him coffee without asking. She had the sort of face that had seen everything and been surprised by none of it. "Passing through?" she said. "Headed to Boysville," said Ronnie. "But not tonight, I think. Cabin 4's open," she said. $3. Bed's clean. "I'll take it," said Ronnie. "And whatever's hot meatloaf," she said. "That'll do." She wrote on a green pad. She turned toward the kitchen. She said, over her shoulder, "Special tonight is meatloaf." She said it to nobody in particular. The man 2 stools down did not turn around. Ronnie drank his coffee. He looked out the window at his Bel Air in the parking lot. The wind was strong enough to move the dust across the gravel in long, slow lines that looked like water. He thought about his wife back in Kansas City. He thought about their little boy who was 7 and had just lost his first tooth. He thought about how tired he was. The meatloaf came. It was good. He ate it slow. When he was done, the woman brought him a slice of peach pie and a fresh cup of coffee, and she said, "Cabin 4, keys on the ring by the door. You just leave it in the lock when you go out in the morning." He thanked her. He paid $3 for the cabin, $1.40 for the meal. He picked up the key. He walked out. The wind was still up. He walked to cabin 4. He unlocked the green door. Inside was a single room, a bed with a chenille bedspread, a nightstand with a lamp and a Gideon Bible, a chair, a small table, a chest of drawers, and a bathroom with a toilet and a sink and a shower stall. There was a small radiator under the window. It was on. The room was warm. Ronnie set his suitcase down. He hung his suit coat on the chair. He took off his shoes. He splashed some water on his face at the sink. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He was so tired that his hands were shaking a little. That's when he heard the sound. It was a small sound, a slow, soft sound. It came from the wall to his left, the wall his bed was against. It was the sound of a man snoring, just barely, slow and steady, in and out. In and out, he listened. He was not surprised. Motor courts have thin walls. There was another guest in cabin 5, and that guest was asleep. Fine. He turned off the lamp. He lay down. The snoring continued. He listened to it. There was something comforting about it. It was the sound of another living person doing the same thing he was doing. He closed his eyes. He slept. He woke at 3 in the morning. He knew it was 3 in the morning because his wristwatch was on the nightstand, and he could see it in the moonlight through the window. The wind had died down. The room was quiet. The snoring next door had stopped. He was thirsty. He got up. He went to the bathroom sink. He drank a glass of water. He came back to the bed. He was about to lie down when he noticed something on the chair. His suit coat had been on the chair. He had hung it there himself. Now it was gone. In its place was a different suit coat, gray. He picked it up. He looked at it. It looked exactly like his suit coat, except the lapel was worn a little bit differently, and there was a small stain on the inside of the sleeve that he did not recognize. He looked at the chair. On the chair, underneath where the coat had been, was a gray felt hat with a black band. He picked it up. He turned it over. Inside the band was a small piece of paper, folded. He unfolded it. It was a receipt from a motor court in the Panhandle, dated March 29th, 1956. Cabin 4, $3. The name on the receipt was Ronald Kestrel. Ronnie sat down slow on the edge of the bed. He looked at his own hat on the little table where he'd put it. It was there, gray felt, black band. He looked at the hat on the chair. It was there, gray felt, black band. He walked over to the small table. He picked up his own hat. He looked inside the band. There was no receipt. He carried the two hats to the window. He held them up in the moonlight. They were the same hat, same size, same wear on the crown, same small oil mark on the inside where his forehead sat. He set the hats down. He walked to the wall on his left, the wall between his cabin and cabin 5. He put his ear against it. He listened. The snoring had started again, soft, slow, in and out. He went to the door of his cabin. He unlocked it. He stepped outside. The wind was down. The moon was up. The gravel was cool under his socks. He walked to cabin 5. He looked at the door. Green, same as his. He looked at the number, 5. He looked in the window. The blinds were drawn, but there was a small gap. He put his eye to it. There was a man in the bed in cabin 5, asleep, on his side, facing the wall. Ronnie could see the back of his head, the shape of his shoulder under the blanket. He could see a gray suit hanging on the chair. He could see a hat on the little table. He watched for a while. The man breathed, slow, steady, in and out. Ronnie went back to his cabin. He locked the door. He sat down in the chair. He held the second hat in his hands. He turned it over. He turned it back. He looked at the receipt again. March 29th, 1956. Ronald Kestrel, cabin 4. He had checked in on March 29th, 1956. This was his receipt, but he had not been given a receipt. He had paid at the counter and taken the key. There had been no paper. He put the hat down. He lay down on the bed. He did not sleep. He waited for morning. Morning came at 6:40. The light through the window was pale and gray. The wind was starting up again. Ronnie got out of bed. His body was heavy. He put on his suit, his own suit, the one he had brought. The other suit coat was still on the chair. The other hat was still on the table. He did not touch them. He went to the cafe. The woman was there, pouring coffee. There was one other person at the counter, a man in a gray suit. His hat was on the counter beside him. The man was Ronnie. Ronnie was sitting at the counter, drinking coffee, looking tired. Ronnie stood in the doorway of the cafe. The woman looked up. She did not seem surprised. "Passing through?" she said. "I checked out already," said Ronnie. "I stayed here last night. Cabin 4. She looked at him, kindly, patiently. "Cabin 4's open," she said. $3. Bed's clean." Ronnie did not move. The man at the counter, the other Ronnie, did not turn around. He was drinking his coffee, slow, steady. Ronnie could see the tiredness in the shoulders. He could see the way the man's hand shook a little, holding the cup. Ronnie backed out of the cafe. He walked to his Bel Air. He got in. He started it. He drove out onto the blacktop. He drove east toward Boyville. He drove for an hour. He drove for 2 hours. He passed no towns. He passed no farms. He passed no other cars. The land was flat and gray and endless. The wind pushed the tumbleweeds across the road in long, slow lines. At about 8:40 in the morning, he came around a long, slow curve in the road, and he saw, off to the right, a little cluster of lights, a neon sign, red and blue, buzzing against the pale morning sky. Diamont Court. He slowed. He did not stop. He drove past it. He kept driving. He drove another hour. He came around another long, slow curve. He saw the sign again. He drove past it. He drove all day. Every hour he passed the Diamond Motor Court. The strange thing, one of the strange things, was that between the sightings of the sign, the world otherwise carried on the way the world carries on. The radio played when he turned it on. The news came out of Amarillo. There were farm reports and a weather forecast calling for wind and possible dust and the price of wheat. The gas gauge dropped slow, the way it should. The engine ran hot and then cooled off again when he cracked the window. Whenever he passed the Diamond, he watched the odometer, and the odometer said he had gone about 60 miles between one diamond and the next. 60 miles of empty highway, then the sign, then 60 more miles. Then the sign, he thought, once that he'd try to catch it in the rear view. He passed the Diamond around 11 in the morning, and he watched the mirror after, watching the sign shrink behind him. He watched it for a full minute. It shrunk the way a thing shrinks when you're driving away from it. It became a small red and blue dot. It became a pinprick. Then it was gone. He drove for another hour. When the next Diamond came into view, he watched it in the windshield first, and then in the rear view after he passed it. Same as before. The mirror worked. Whatever was happening, it was not happening in the mirror. Around 1 in the afternoon, he tried a different thing. He came around a curve. He saw the sign in the distance. He pulled over onto the shoulder before he reached it. He got out. He stood by the driver's side door in the wind, and he watched. The Diamond sat about a half-mile ahead of him, off the right shoulder, exactly the way it had sat every other time he'd seen it. He watched it for 10 minutes. Nothing moved. No cars came in. No cars left. The cafe lights were on. The neon buzzed. The wind blew tumbleweeds across the gravel lot. Everything was as it had been. He got back in the Bel Air. He drove past. He watched the Diamond in the rear view until it was gone. He drove another hour. The next Diamond appeared. He pulled over again. He got out. He looked at it. Same. Exactly the same. Same 2 cars in the lot, a dusty pickup and a black sedan. He was sure the pickup had been in the last one, too. He had not been sure the first time he'd noticed it. He was sure now. He got back in. He drove at about 2:30. He tried something else. He came around a curve. He saw the Diamond in the distance. He slowed the Bel Air to a crawl, and he pulled off the road onto the shoulder about 100 yards short of the entrance. He got out. He walked. He walked toward the Diamond on foot, along the shoulder, in the wind, his hat in his hand. The Diamond did not get any closer. He walked for 10 minutes. He looked back at his car. His car was maybe 200 yards behind him now. He looked ahead. The Diamond was still about 100 yards ahead. He walked another 10 minutes. His car was smaller behind him. The Diamond was the same size ahead. He stopped. He stood in the wind. He said, out loud, "All right." He turned around. He walked back to the Bel Air. It got closer the way it should. 200 yards, 150, 10. He reached it. He got in. he drove. He passed the diamond a minute later. He tried one more thing before he stopped trying things. He came around a curve, and he saw the diamond, and this time he did not pull off. He did not slow down. He held the gas pedal steady at 60 miles an hour. He drove straight past. As he passed the cafe, he looked in through the front window. There, at the counter, was a man in a gray suit, drinking coffee, his hat on the counter, his shoulders in the exact tired slump that Ronnie recognized from looking at himself in the morning shave mirror. The man in the cafe turned his head just slightly as the Bel Air went past. Ronnie could not see the face clearly through the glass and the movement, but he saw the shape of it. He saw the way the head tilted. He saw the hand lift just an inch off the counter. Not a wave, just an acknowledgement. Ronnie drove on. He did not look back. There were things he thought about in the hours that followed that he did not tell me the first time he told me this story. He told me the second time. He said, in the hours of driving, he began to remember things, small things, things he had not thought about in years. He remembered a summer when he was 9 years old. His grandmother had taken him to visit her cousin who lived in a little house at the end of a long dirt road in southeastern Colorado. It was a summer of a bad drought. The cousin had a Victrola and a jar of Horehound candy on the sideboard and a rocking chair on the porch. Ronnie had sat in the rocking chair one evening by himself while his grandmother and the cousin were inside, and he had watched a storm build over the plains to the west. Blue-black clouds, lightning walking along the ground on white legs. He had watched the storm come toward the house, and he had thought, in a way a 9-year-old boy sometimes thinks something without knowing where the thought came from. If I get up out of this chair, the storm will hit me. If I stay in this chair, the storm will pass by. He had stayed in the chair. The storm had passed by. It had gone north of the house, half a mile off, and had rained on somebody else's fields. He had never told anybody about the thought. He had forgotten it. For 40 years, he remembered a girl he had almost married back in 1939, before the war. Her name was Alma. She had blue eyes and a laugh that came from deep in her chest. She had wanted to move to California. He had wanted to stay in Kansas City. They had argued about it in a car parked outside a movie theater one October night. He had said things he regretted. She had gotten out of the car. She had walked home. He had let her walk. He had told himself he would call her the next day. He had not called. She had married a man from Bakersfield 6 months later. Ronnie had gone to the war. He had come back. He had met his wife at a church picnic in 1946. He had built a life. He had been happy in it, mostly, but sitting in the Bel Air on that Panhandle blacktop, 42 years old, at the end of a long day of not getting anywhere, Ronnie thought about Alma for the first time in a long time, and he understood that there were places in his life where he had gotten out of the chair, and there were places where he had stayed, and he did not know anymore which of the two had brought him here. He remembered a night in the Ardennes in December of 1944 when he had lain in a foxhole in the snow for 11 hours and had not moved because he had known, with the certainty a man sometimes has, that if he moved he would die. He had lain still. Men on either side of him had died. He had lived. He had come home. He had never told anybody about the certainty. It had felt at the time like a gift given to him by something that did not have to give it. He remembered these things as he drove. and the road unspooled, and the sign came, and the sign went, and the sign came, and the sign went. He began to wonder if the Diamond Motor Court had been waiting for him for a long time. If the road he was on had bends in it he had passed already, years ago, decades ago, in other seasons of his life. If he had come close, once or twice, and had gotten back in the chair and had let it pass by. He wondered if this time he was not getting back in the chair. He thought, too, about the woman behind the counter. He thought about her voice when she had said passing through, about the kindness of it, about the way she had not been surprised to see him, about how a person got a job like that, behind a counter, in a place like that, with a coffee pot in her hand, and whether she had chosen it, or whether it had chosen her, or whether the question of choosing meant anything at all in a place where the road brought the same tired man in from the highway 1 hour, and then the next hour, and then the next. He thought this was the thought he came back to, over and over, as the afternoon wore into evening. He thought that maybe she was somebody's mother, somebody's grandmother. Maybe she had been a girl once, in a town, with a life, and something had happened on a highway one night, and now she poured coffee. Maybe she was Alma. Maybe Alma had gotten out of that Bakersfield car one night and walked into a Diamond Motor Court somewhere on a West Texas road and had never left. Maybe he was driving to her now. Maybe he had always been driving to her. By evening, the sun was low, and the light was the color of a bruise, and the Bel Air was thirsty. The gas gauge read a quarter tank, and then an eighth, and then the needle drifted below E, and the engine started to cough a little when he pressed the pedal. He came around a long, slow curve in the road. He saw the sign. He knew this time that he could not drive past. He was out of gas. He was out of hours. But it was not the gas that decided him. That, he told me, was what he wanted me to understand. He could have coasted another mile or two on the fumes and the downgrade. He could have tried. He did not try. He pulled off the road, because the road, at that hour, in that light, on that curve, had the shape of a question a man had been asking himself for a very long time. And Ronnie Kestrel, traveling salesman, 39 years old, tired, husband to a woman in Kansas City, father to a boy who had just lost his first tooth, pulled off because he understood that his answer, when it came, was going to be somewhere on the other side of a green door in a cabin numbered 4. Same sign, same 6 cabins, same L shape, same gravel lot. Sometimes there were 2 cars in the lot. Sometimes there were 3. Once there were 7. All of them Chevrolet Bel Airs, blue on the bottom, white on the top. He did not stop. By evening, he had almost no gas left. The sun was going down. The wind was up. He came around a long, slow curve. He saw the sign. He knew he could not drive past it again. He was out of gas. He was out of choices. He pulled off the road. He parked. He got out. The wind hit him in the face, and he put his hand on his hat. He walked into the cafe. Inside was warmer than he'd expected. The cafe was small. Behind the counter was a woman about 60 years old, gray hair pinned up, apron over a blue dress. 2 stools down from where Ronnie sat, there was a man in a gray suit drinking coffee. There was another man in a gray suit at the far end of the counter, and a third man in a gray suit in the front booth eating meatloaf. None of them looked up when Ronnie came in. The woman looked at him. Kindly, patiently. "Passing through?" she said. Ronnie sat down on the stool. He put his hat on the counter. He looked at his hands. They were older than they had been that morning. Not much older. but older. He did not look up at the woman. He said quietly, "Cabin 4? Cabin 4's open," she said. $3. Bed's clean. He nodded. He paid. He took the key. He walked out. He walked to cabin 4. He unlocked the green door. Inside was a single room. On the chair was a gray suit coat. On the table was a gray felt hat with a black band. In the wall to his left, very faint, was the sound of a man snoring. Slow, steady, in and out, Ronnie set his suitcase down. He hung his suit coat on the chair, next to the other one. He put his hat on the table, next to the other one. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He was so tired that his hands were shaking a little. He listened to the snoring. He understood, sitting there, that the man in cabin 5 was him. He understood that the man in cabin 4 before him had been him. He understood that the men in the cafe were him. He understood that the Diamond Motor Court had 6 cabins, and that 6 was a number he was going to become intimate with. He understood that he had checked in a very long time ago, and that he would not be checking out. He turned off the lamp. He lay down. He closed his eyes. Somewhere in the wall to his left, another Ronnie breathed. Somewhere in the parking lot, another Bel Air pulled in. Somewhere in the cafe, another woman poured another cup of coffee for another tired man and said kindly, patiently, "Passing through." And Ronnie Kestrel, in cabin 4, in 1956, or in every year at once, breathed slow and steady, and in and out, and the wind blew across the panhandle, and the neon sign buzzed, and the road went on, and the road came back, and the road went on again. I told you at the beginning of this one that I lived it myself, or I think I did, and that my memory was not what it was. I want to tell you why I said that, because it matters, I think, to the telling. I was a young man in 1956. I was traveling through the Panhandle that spring. I was headed east on business. I will not say what business, because it does not matter, and because I am not entirely sure anymore what it was, and I stopped one night at a motor court off a 2-lane blacktop between Amarillo and a little town called Boisville. I do not remember the name of the motor court. I remember the neon sign, red and blue, buzzing against the dark. I remember the shape of the L. I remember the 6 little stucco cabins with the green doors. I remember the woman behind the counter, gray hair pinned up, apron over a blue dress. I remember she poured me coffee without asking. I remember she was kind. I do not remember checking out. I remember, after that night, driving east for what I thought was a day, and then arriving home, and my wife asking me where I had been, because she had expected me 3 days earlier. I remember I could not answer her. I remember she looked at me strangely, and she went into the kitchen, and she made me a sandwich, and she did not ask again. I remember, after that, small things missing from my life. A watch I had owned since college, a pair of shoes, a small photograph of my grandfather that had been in my wallet. I remember I could not find them. I remember I never did find them. I remember, some years later, driving through the Panhandle again on a different trip, and looking for the motor court and not finding it. I remember stopping at a diner in a little town near where I thought it should have been, and asking the waitress, and her saying she had never heard of a Diamond Motor Court. I remember driving the same stretch of road 3 times in the middle of the day in bright sun and not seeing any sign of it. No neon, no cabins, no gravel lot, just fields and fence line and the endless Panhandle wind. I have wondered ever since whether I dreamed it. I have wondered whether I was Ronnie Kestrel. I have wondered whether I am still there, some small, tired part of me, in a cabin numbered 4, listening to a man snore in the wall to my left, waiting for a morning that will bring me back to the counter and the coffee and the woman who says, kindly, patiently, passing through. I have wondered whether the man telling you this story right now, sitting by the fire, telling it slow, with the rain falling on the tin roof, is the man who left the diamond or the man who stayed. I do not know how to know. I only know I have gray felt hats in my closet that I do not remember buying. I know I have 3 of them. I know the linings all have the same small oil mark on the inside where a forehead sits. I know none of the hats have receipts in them. I have checked. Story 4. The man who told me this story died the following spring. I never learned if that was connected. He was an old fisherman out of a little town in Maine, and he told it to me on a bench outside a hardware store in October, with his hands wrapped around a paper cup of chowder, and he did not embellish. Now listen close. This is how he told it. Her name was Delia Ashcraft. She was 44 years old in the winter of 1978, and she worked as a night nurse for an elderly woman named Constance Peel, who lived alone in a saltbox cottage on the edge of a small fishing village on the coast of Maine. The village was called Cold Harbor. It was the sort of place where the fog rolled in off the water at 4 in the afternoon in winter, and the boats came in at dusk with their lights on, and everybody knew everybody's grandparents. Delia had come to Cold Harbor 2 years earlier from Providence. After her marriage had ended, and she had taken the night nurse job because it paid enough to live on, and because it was quiet, and because Mrs. Peel liked her. Mrs. Peel was 89 years old, mostly bedridden, sharp as a tack in the head, but weak in the body, and she liked to be read to at night. Delia read to her. From 9 in the evening until 6 in the morning, 6 nights a week, Delia sat by Mrs. Peel's bed, or made her tea, or helped her to the bathroom, or read to her from novels by Agatha Christie and Daphne du Maurier, and in the small hours, she often had 2 or 3 hours to herself while Mrs. Peel slept. The cottage was a 1.5-story salt box, gray shingled, weathered to silver, standing on a low bluff above a small cove. There was a front room with a fireplace, a kitchen, Mrs. Peel's bedroom on the ground floor, and up a narrow staircase, a single small bedroom under the eaves where Delia slept on her nights off. On her nights on, she used a chair by Mrs. Peel's bed and, when Mrs. Peel was sleeping, small couch in the front room. The story starts on a Thursday night in early February. It had snowed all day. Not a blizzard, just a slow, patient snowfall, the kind that piles up on the eaves and muffles every sound. By the time Delia arrived at the cottage at 8:45 in the evening, there was about 6 inches on the ground. She stamped her boots on the porch, came inside, hung her coat on the hook by the door, and hung her mittens on the same hook. She had knitted the mittens herself, out of dark blue wool with a little red stripe around the cuff. They were her favorite pair. She checked on Mrs. Peel, who was awake and wanted tea. Delia made the tea. She read a chapter of a novel. It was Rebecca. Delia remembered later, and they had reached the part about the boathouse. Mrs. Peel fell asleep around 10:30. Delia went to the front room, sat on the couch, took out her knitting, and settled in. At about 11:40, she heard the front door. It was not a knock. It was the sound of the door opening, the soft creak the hinges made, the small draft of cold air the whisper of snow being knocked off boots on the doormat. Delia looked up. She listened. The front room was on the other side of the wall from the entryway. From where she sat, she could see the archway that led to the hall, but she could not see the door itself. She waited. She thought maybe it was Mrs. Peel's son, who lived in Portland and sometimes came by on weekends but never at night. She called out softly, "Frank?" There was no answer. She set down her knitting. She stood up. She walked to the archway. She looked into the hall. The hall was empty. The door was closed. The mat was clean of new snow, but her mittens were gone from the hook. Delia stood there for a moment, looking at the hook. Her coat was still there. Her hat was still there, but the two dark blue mittens with the red stripes were gone. She looked at the floor. She looked around the entryway. She checked the pockets of her coat. She checked the front porch. She checked the couch in the front room where she'd been sitting. She checked Mrs. Peel's room quietly so as not to wake her. The mittens were gone. She decided she must have misplaced them somewhere without noticing. She was tired. It was late. She went back to the couch and picked up her knitting. At about 1:15 in the morning, she heard footsteps. They came from upstairs, from the little bedroom under the eaves where she sometimes slept. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They crossed the floor of the small room from one side to the other. Then they stopped. Delia sat very still on the couch. Nobody was upstairs. She was certain of it. She had checked the whole house when she arrived, out of habit. The upstairs was empty. She got up. She went to the bottom of the narrow staircase. She listened. Nothing. She waited a long minute. Then she started up the stairs. The staircase was narrow, and it turned to the left halfway up. As she reached the turn, she could see into the small bedroom. The door was open. The light was off. She reached in, felt for the switch, and turned it on. The bedroom was empty. The bed was made the way she'd left it. The small dresser stood against the wall. The chair by the window was empty. The rag rug on the floor was smooth. But on the pillow of the bed, laid out neat, was one of her mittens, just the one. The left mitten, dark blue with the red stripe. She picked it up. It was cold, colder than it should have been in a heated room. It was cold the way a mitten is cold when you first come in from outside. She held it in her hand, and she stood in the doorway of the little room, and she felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She went back downstairs, carrying the mitten. She checked the door hook again. The right mitten was not there. She checked the hall. She checked the couch. She checked everywhere. The right mitten was gone. She sat down on the couch with the left mitten in her lap. She looked at it. She turned it over. She looked inside it. There was nothing inside it. It was just a mitten. She thought, very reasonably, that she must have taken it upstairs herself at some point earlier in the evening and forgotten. Maybe she had gone up to fetch something. Maybe she had set it on the pillow without thinking. The mind does strange things when a person is tired. She was tired. She had worked 6 nights in a row that week. She put the left mitten on the little table by the couch. She picked up her knitting. She kept knitting. At about 2:30 in the morning, Mrs. Peel called from the bedroom. Delia set down her knitting and went to her. Mrs. Peel was awake, sitting up a little, and there was a look on her face that Delia had not seen before. Not fear exactly, more like puzzlement. "Delia," said Mrs. Peel, "who was that woman?" "What woman, Mrs. Peel?" "The one who just came in, the one who stood in the doorway. She looked in at me. Delia felt something cold settle in her chest. Nobody came in, Mrs. Peel. It's just us. Mrs. Peel looked at her, very steady, very sharp. She looked just like you, Delia, but her hair was wet. And she had on your coat, and she had on one mitten. The left one, I think. And she stood in the doorway, and she looked in at me, and she smiled, and then she went upstairs. I heard her go up the stairs. Delia sat down slowly on the chair by the bed. How long ago, Mrs. Peel? Just now, just before I called you. 2, 3 minutes, maybe. Delia thought about her knitting. She had been knitting for the last 20 minutes without getting up. She had heard no footsteps, no door. Are you sure, Mrs. Peel? Delia, dear, said Mrs. Peel, I'm 89 years old, and I've never been surer of a thing in my life. Somebody who looks just like you came in this house tonight, and she went upstairs, and I don't like it. Delia said, gently, I'll go check. She got up. She left the bedroom. She stood in the hall. She looked at the stairs. She did not want to go up. She wanted, more than anything she had ever wanted, to put on her coat and walk out into the snow and drive home and not come back. She did not do that. She went up the stairs. At the top, she reached in and turned on the light. The small bedroom under the eaves was empty. The bed was made. The chair by the window was empty. The rag rug was smooth, but on the pillow of the bed was the left mitten again. Only now, next to it, was the right one. Delia stood in the doorway. She had left the left mitten on the little table by the couch, downstairs. She had not touched it since. She looked at the 2 mittens on the pillow. They were laid out neat, the way a person lays out gloves before they go out, cuff to cuff, side by side. Left glove on the left, right glove on the right. She walked into the room. She picked up the left mitten. She turned it over. Something was different. She held it up to the light. Inside the cuff, in small stitches, in the dark blue wool, was a name embroidered. It said Delia, in her own handwriting, in her own stitches. Only she had never embroidered her name into her mittens. She picked up the right mitten. She turned it over. Inside the cuff, in the same small stitches, in her handwriting, was another name. It said Constance. Delia sat down on the edge of the bed. She held the 2 mittens in her hands. She looked at the names. Delia, Constance. She understood. She did not want to understand, but she understood. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked, just softly. It came from downstairs. It might have been the front door. It might have been the door to Mrs. Peel's bedroom. Delia sat on the bed for a long minute. She listened. She heard nothing else. The house was quiet the way a salt box is quiet in a snowstorm, soft, cushioned, deep. She got up. She walked downstairs, slowly, carrying the 2 mittens. She reached the bottom of the stairs. She turned into the hall. She walked toward Mrs. Peel's bedroom. The door was open. She stepped into the doorway. Mrs. Peel was in the bed. She was very still. Her eyes were open, and they were looking at the ceiling, and they were not looking at anything at all. Delia knew before she checked. She checked anyway. She held Mrs. Peel's wrist. She held the back of her own hand under Mrs. Peel's nose. She waited. Nothing. Constance Peel had died. Sometime in the last 5 minutes. Sometime while Delia was upstairs, holding the mittens, Delia sat down in the chair by the bed. She put the 2 mittens on her lap. She looked at Mrs. Peel's face. There was a small smile on it. Not a big smile, just a small one. As if the last thing Mrs. Peel had seen had been something familiar, something that had come to walk her home. Delia sat there for a long time. The clock on the mantel in the front room ticked. The snow fell outside the window. Somewhere in the far distance, out in the harbor, a bell buoy tolled. She got up, finally. She walked to the phone in the kitchen. She dialed Frank, the son in Portland. She told him. He was quiet. He said he'd be there in 3 hours. He thanked her for taking care of his mother. She hung up. She sat down at the kitchen table. She looked at the 2 mittens in her hand. She looked at the names inside them. Delia, Constance. She wondered quietly, in a way she was not sure she wanted to answer, which mitten she was. She heard, from the hall, the sound of the front door opening. She heard the whisper of snow being knocked off boots on the doormat. She did not look up. She did not turn around. She sat very still at the kitchen table, and she held the 2 mittens on her lap, and she listened as somebody who wore her face and her coat and her hair walked slowly, quietly up the narrow staircase and crossed the floor of the small bedroom under the eaves, and lay down on the bed where Delia herself sometimes slept, and let out one soft breath and became still. Delia sat at the table until Frank arrived at 4 in the morning. When he came in, she looked up at him, and she smiled a small smile that was not quite her own, and she said, "She's in the bedroom." She went peaceful. Frank thanked her again. He said she should go home and sleep. She said she would. She put on her coat. She put on her mittens, the left one first, then the right one. She stepped out into the snow. She walked to her car. She did not look up at the little bedroom under the eaves. She did not want to see whose face was in the window, watching her go. She drove home. She slept. She dreamed of nothing. The next day, she looked inside her mittens. The names were still there, embroidered in her own hand. Delia, Constance. She sat with them a long time. Then she put them in a drawer. She still wore them, sometimes, in the years that followed. But before I tell you what she noticed about the mittens, and about her hands, and about the little transition between one glove and the other, I have to tell you what happened in the 2 weeks after Mrs. Peel died, because those 2 weeks were the part Delia kept coming back to in the years afterward, the way a tongue keeps coming back to a sore tooth. Mrs. Peel's funeral was held on the following Monday at the little Congregational Church in Cold Harbor. It snowed again that morning, a fine cold snow that whitened the granite of the cemetery stones and softened the sound of the mourners' boots on the frozen ground. Frank was there, and his wife, and their 2 children who had flown in from Boston. A few old friends of Mrs. Peel's, women in wool coats, men with faces gone red from the wind. Delia stood at the back of the small gathering. She had put on her best dress. She had put on her mittens, the left one first and then the right one. She had put them in her coat pocket before she reached the church, so nobody would see them. She did not know why she wanted to keep them hidden. She only knew she did. The service was short. The minister said kind, tired things about a life well lived. Trá Cearc. Frank spoke a few words about his mother's love of the ocean and her devotion to the Agatha Christie novels she had read every night for the last 20 years of her life. Delia looked at her boots. She did not look at the coffin. She could not have said at that moment whose funeral she was afraid she was attending. After the service, Frank came over to her at the door of the church. He had aged 10 years in the 4 days since his mother had died. He took her hand, her bare hand. She had taken off her mittens to shake his, and he thanked her again for taking care of his mother. And then he said, in a soft voice, "Delia, Ma left you something. It's in the will. You should come by the house tomorrow if you can." She said she would. She went by on Tuesday afternoon at 3. The snow had stopped. The bay looked flat and gray. The salt box on the bluff looked smaller without Mrs. Peel in it, the way a house always does after somebody has gone from it for good. Frank let her in. He had a fire in the front room and a pot of coffee on the stove. He poured her a cup. They sat at the kitchen table. "Ma left you the mittens," he said. Delia felt something cool move down the back of her neck. "Which mittens, Frank?" "The blue ones you knitted. Ma said you left 'em here, that last night. She said in the will, I'm holding the actual will right here," she said, and I quote, "To Delia Ashcraft, my nurse and my companion in the small hours, the pair of dark blue mittens with the red stripes, which she left with me and which I have kept." He looked up at her. "I don't understand it, honest. Ma wrote her will 3 years ago. She updated it every year. This line about the mittens has been in there the whole time. I asked her about it once, and she just laughed and said, 'Some things you know before you know 'em, Frank.' She said not to worry about it." Delia said quietly, "Where are they, Frank?" "Upstairs, in the little bedroom under the eaves. I found 'em on the pillow of the bed when I was cleaning out this weekend." Ma didn't go upstairs, Delia. She hadn't been upstairs in 5 years. Her knees wouldn't let her. But there they were, on the pillow, neat as anything. He shook his head. Ma was full of surprises, right to the end. "Anyway, they're yours, if you want 'em." Delia said after a small silence, "I already have 'em, Frank." "You do?" "I took 'em home the morning after. I don't know how they got upstairs, but that's where I found 'em, and I took 'em." Frank looked at her a long moment. He said slowly, "Delia, then whose are the ones on the pillow?" She did not know how to answer. She said, "Show me." They went up the narrow staircase. Frank ahead, Delia behind. The little bedroom under the eaves was the way she remembered it. Bed made, chair by the window, rag rug on the floor. On the pillow, laid out neat, were 2 mittens. Dark blue wool, red stripe around the cuff. Cuff to cuff, left glove on the left, right glove on the right. Delia went to the bed. She picked up the left mitten. She turned it over. Inside the cuff, in small stitches in dark blue wool, was a name embroidered. It said Delia, in her own handwriting, in her own stitches. She picked up the right mitten. She turned it over. Inside the cuff, in the same small stitches, was another name. It said Delia. Delia stood in the little bedroom holding the 2 mittens for a long time. Frank watched her. She did not know how her face looked. She hoped it looked ordinary. She wrapped the 2 mittens together, one inside the other, and she put them in the pocket of her coat, and she said, in the calmest voice she could find, "Thank you, Frank. These mean a great deal to me." He nodded. He walked her to the door. He watched her walk down the drive to her car. She waved. He waved back. She drove home. She put the mittens on her kitchen table. She took the other pair, the ones that said Delia and Constance, out of the drawer where she had put them the morning after Mrs. Peel died. She laid all 4 on the table. 2 left mittens, 2 right mittens, 4 in total. She looked at them. She sat down at the table. She looked at them a long time. She noticed a small thing. The pair that said Delia and Delia was slightly newer. The wool was a little brighter. The red stripe was a little sharper. The pair that said Delia and Constance was slightly older. It had a small pill of wool at the cuff of the left one that Delia recognized. She had made that pair in 1976 out of a skein of wool she'd bought at a yarn store in Portland. She remembered the color of the store's front door. She remembered the smell of the yarn. She did not remember making the newer pair. but her hands did. When she picked up the newer left mitten and turned it inside out, she could see the way the stitches had been done. She was a knitter of 30 years. She knew her own stitches the way a woman knows her own signature. These were her stitches. The tension was hers. The little error at the thumb, the small doubled stitch she always made when she was tired and turning a corner, that was hers. She had made both pairs, only she remembered making one. She got up. She went to her closet. In the back of the closet was a wicker basket where she kept her knitting. She sat down on the floor and she went through the basket, ball of yarn by ball of yarn. Near the bottom, she found a small skein of dark blue wool. About a third of it had been used. She knew that yarn. She had bought it in the fall of 1977 to make a new pair of mittens because her old ones, the ones from the Portland store, had gotten a hole. She had never gotten around to making the new pair. She had put the skein in the basket. She had not touched it in a year. The skein was a third gone, enough for a pair of mittens. She sat on the floor of the closet a long time. She thought about the nights she had worked at Mrs. Peel's, the long quiet hours from 9 in the evening until 6 in the morning, the knitting she had done sitting on the little couch in the front room. She thought about how many nights she had gone home and could not remember exactly what she had knitted. She thought about the way her hands sometimes seemed to know things her head did not. She thought about how, in the years since her marriage had ended, she had gotten used to living inside herself very quietly, and how sometimes she looked up and an hour had gone by and she could not have said what she had been doing in it. She thought about the woman in the doorway of Mrs. Peel's bedroom, the one with the wet hair and the one mitten. Mrs. Peel had said she smiled. Mrs. Peel had said she went upstairs. Delia sat on the closet floor and she said, out loud, in a small voice, "Which one of us is which?" The house did not answer, but somewhere far above her, in the small bedroom under the eaves of a house on a bluff in Cold Harbor, a pair of mittens lay on a pillow. And somewhere, she thought, in a room she could not name, another Delia was sitting at a kitchen table, holding a pair of mittens, asking the same question and getting the same silence for an answer. That evening, she made a decision. She got up off the closet floor. She washed her face. She combed her hair. She made a cup of tea. She sat down at the kitchen table. She picked up the older pair, the Delia and Constance pair, and she looked at them a long moment. Then she got up, walked to the wood stove, opened the door, and put them in the fire. She watched them burn. The wool curled and blackened. The red stripes went last. When it was done, she closed the stove. She sat back down. The newer pair, the Delia and Delia pair, she kept. She wore them sometimes in the years that followed. She noticed a thing. Whenever she put them on, she always put on the left one first. And when she took them off, she always took off the right one first. And she never, not once, allowed both hands to be gloved at the same instant. There was always, in the small transition between one mitten and the other, a moment when only her left hand was covered. And in that moment, if you had asked her, she would not have been able to tell you her own name. She never took another night nursing job. She moved south a few years later to Charleston because she wanted heat and light and long afternoons on porches. She did well for herself. She made friends. She lived to be old. But sometimes, she said, in the last hour before dawn, when the house was quiet and she was alone in her bed and the ceiling fan turned slow above her, she would hear, just faintly, the sound of somebody knitting, the small, soft click of two needles working against each other, coming from the room next to hers. And she would lie there, and she would listen, and she would think about a saltbox cottage on a bluff, and about a small bedroom under the eaves, and about a pair of mittens on a pillow. And she would think. She told me this on the bench outside the hardware store, and I have not forgotten it. She would think, one of us has to keep knitting so that the other one keeps existing. So we keep going. And she would close her eyes, and she would sleep, or she would not sleep. And either way, in the morning, she would put on her left mitten first. There is one more thing I want to tell you about Delia Ashcraft, and then I will let this story rest, and we will move on. Many years after the winter of 1978, long after she had moved to Charleston, long after she had made peace with her mittens and her left-handed mornings, Delia went, on a whim, back to Cold Harbor. It was a Sunday afternoon in September. She had rented a car in Boston and driven up the coast, and she had told nobody she was going. She had not been back in more than 20 years. The town was smaller than she remembered. The little Congregational church was still there. The general store was still there, though the sign was new. The harbor was full of pleasure boats now, where before it had been full of working ones. She drove out along the shore road, past the summer houses, past the low stone walls, past the wild rose bushes bent by the wind. She came at last to the little bluff. The saltbox cottage was still there. It was well kept. Somebody was living in it now. There was a car in the drive and flower boxes at the windows, and a small wooden sign at the end of the walk that said, in painted letters, "The Ospreys." She sat in her rental car at the side of the road, and she looked at the house, and she did not go up to the door. She sat there a long time. She looked up at the window of the small bedroom under the eaves. The window was open. A white curtain moved in the breeze. She could see, in the dim room behind the curtain, the corner of a bed. On the pillow of the bed, she could see something dark, something folded, something small and neat laid out. She could not tell from the road what it was. She could have gotten out of the car. She could have walked up the drive. She could have knocked on the door and asked the people who lived there, politely, if she could see the little bedroom. She could have said she was a friend of the previous owners. They probably would have let her in. Folks are kind, mostly, when you ask them plain. She did not get out of the car. She sat and she looked, and after a while, the curtain in the upstairs window stirred a little more, and something behind it moved. Just a shadow, just the shape of a person passing the window from one side of the room to the other. It was not, she was almost certain, a person from the house. It was somebody in the room by themselves, on a Sunday afternoon in September, in a small bedroom that had a folded thing on the pillow. The shadow paused. It stood at the window. It looked out. Delia sat in her rental car, and she looked back. She could not see the face. The curtain was in the way, but she could see the shape of the head, and the slope of the shoulders, and the way the person stood. One hand raised, resting against the window frame, and she knew that shape. She had lived inside that shape for 60-some years. She knew it the way a woman knows her own reflection. She lifted her hand from the steering wheel. Just a little. Just a small wave. The shape in the window lifted its hand back. Delia sat there another few minutes. Then she started the rental car. She drove back down the shore road. She drove back to Boston. She flew home to Charleston. She did not go back again. She told me, on the same porch where she had told me the first part of it, she told me she did not feel afraid. Seeing the shape in the window, she said what she felt was something more like relief. She said it meant she was still there. It meant she had been keeping at it. All those years while I was living my life down south, drinking my sweet tea, planting my roses, she'd been up there in that little bedroom, knitting at her end, keeping the two of us going. I owed her a wave, mister. That's all it was. I owed her a wave. She sipped her tea. She watched the light change on her garden. She said softly, I hope somebody waves at me too someday, when it's my turn to be the one in the window. I have thought about that a great deal since. I have thought about how many rooms there are, in how many houses, with somebody in them keeping somebody else going. I have thought about the small courtesies we owe to the parts of ourselves we have left behind in old houses. I do not have an answer for you tonight, friend. I only have the story, and I have told it as she told it, and I have tried in the telling to wave a little myself, just a small one, in case it helps. Story 5. This story sat in my journal for 40 years before I understood it. It was told to me by a man who worked the graveyards of southern Louisiana in the middle of the last century, and he told it to me on a hot night on a porch outside of Baton Rouge, and I did not know, when I wrote it down, that it was a story about myself as much as it was about him. Now listen close. His name was Wallace Brune. Everybody called him Wally. He was 52 years old in the summer of 1938, and he was the groundskeeper of a small Catholic cemetery on the edge of a bayou parish in southern Louisiana. The cemetery was called Our Lady of the Waters. It had about 600 graves, some of them dating back to the 1790s, and it sat on a low rise of ground, surrounded on 3 sides by cypress swamp. Wally lived by himself in a little house on stilts about a quarter mile from the cemetery, down a shell road that turned to mud in the rainy season. The house had 3 rooms, a front room with a stove and a table, a back room where he slept, and a small screened porch that overlooked the bayou. He had been born in that house. His father had built it in 1902. His mother had died in it in 1928. Wally had lived alone in it ever since. He had never married. He had no children he knew of. He had a dog once, a hound named Otis, but Otis had died in the winter of '37, and Wally had not gotten another dog after that. The cemetery paid him $38 a month. He kept the grass cut, he tended the flower beds, he dug the graves, he closed them up. He knew every marker in the place. He knew who lay under each one. He talked to them, sometimes in his head. He was not a religious man in the church-going sense, but he was religious in the way that a man who has spent 30 years among the dead becomes religious. Quiet, watchful, patient. He believed the dead had opinions. He believed they mostly wanted to be left alone. The story begins on a Wednesday night in August. It was hot, the kind of Louisiana August night where the air feels like a wet cloth pressed against your face, and the cicadas are so loud you cannot hear yourself think. Wally had come home from the cemetery around 7. He had eaten a piece of cornbread and some red beans left over from the night before. He had washed his one plate and his one fork. He had gone out onto the screened porch to sit and smoke his pipe. The bayou was quiet. The moon was up, big and yellow, and it lay on the water like a coin. The frogs were singing. Somewhere far off, a barred owl was calling. Wally rocked in his chair. He watched the water. He smoked his pipe. At about 9:40, he heard somebody walking up the Shell Road. He did not turn his head. The porch faced the bayou, not the road. He listened. The footsteps were slow, steady. They came up the road at the pace of a person who had walked a long way and was in no particular hurry. He heard them reach the bottom of his porch steps. He heard them come up the steps, one at a time. He heard them cross the porch. He heard the screen door open and close behind him. He kept looking at the water. Somebody stood behind his chair. He could feel them there. He did not turn around. He said, "Evening." There was a pause. Then a voice, a woman's voice, soft, tired, said, "Evening, Wally." He knew the voice. He had known it all his life. He turned around slowly. His mother stood in the doorway of the porch. She was wearing the blue dress she had died in 1928. Her hair was pinned up the way she had always pinned it. Her hands were folded in front of her. She looked exactly as he remembered her, except that she was not tired anymore. She looked rested. She looked young. Wally had spent 10 years amongst the dead. He was not a man who scared easy. He looked at her a long moment. Then he said, "Ma, what are you doing here?" She smiled a small smile. "I came to see you," she said. "It's been a while." "It has," said Wally. She came and sat down in the other rocking chair on the porch, the one that had been his father's. She did not make any sound when she sat. The chair did not rock, though her body seemed to settle into it. Wally looked at her. He looked at the way the moonlight fell on the porch floor. He noticed a thing. His mother did not have a shadow. He did not say anything about it. He said, "How you been?" "I've been fine, Wally, been fine. It's peaceful where I am." "That's good," he said. "That's real good." They sat a while. The frogs sang. The bayou moved slow against the pilings under the house. His mother rocked, or seemed to rock, though the chair did not move. After a bit, she said, "Wally, I need to tell you something." "Yes, Ma, there's a fella coming by, tomorrow or the day after. He'll ask you some questions. About the cemetery, about the plots. He's from up north. He's going to say some things that will trouble you. I want you to know, before he comes, that you don't need to answer him. You don't need to say anything at all. You just show him around and you let him go, and you don't worry about it." Wally looked at her. "Ma, what kind of questions?" "Ah, just questions, Wally. Just questions about who's in what plot, where the records are, that kind of thing. The records are in the church office. Anybody could tell him that." "I know," said his mother, "but he might ask you personal-like, and I want you to know you don't owe him nothing." Wally thought about that. He said, "All right, Ma." His mother reached over and patted his hand. He felt her hand. It was cool, not cold, just cool, the way a stone is cool in the shade. "You're a good boy, Wally," she said. "Thank you, Ma." She got up. She walked to the screen door. She opened it. She went out. He heard her cross the porch, go down the steps, walk down the Shell Road. He heard her footsteps fade until he could not hear them any more. He did not turn around to watch her go. He sat on the porch until the moon set. He smoked his pipe until it went out. He thought about his mother. He thought about what she had said. He did not know what to make of it. In the morning, he did not know if he had dreamed it or not. But 2 days later, a man came. The man drove up the Shell Road in a black Ford. He got out. He was maybe 35, thin, wore a gray suit that was wrong for the weather. He had a briefcase. He walked up to Wally, who was cutting grass at the cemetery, and he introduced himself. His name was Mr. Halloran. He was a lawyer. He was from a firm in New York. He was representing the estate of a family that had, apparently, once owned land in this parish, and he was trying to find some records. Wally shook his hand. He turned off the mower. He said, "Records are up at the church, sir." "Yes," said Mr. Halloran. "I've been to the church. They referred me to you. They said you know the cemetery better than anyone." "I know it," said Wally. Mr. Halloran opened his briefcase. He took out a piece of paper. He said, "I'm looking for a plot. The family name is Brune." Wally did not move for a long moment. He said, "That's my family name." "Yes," said Mr. Halloran. "I understand your parents are buried here." "They are, along with my grandparents and my great-grandparents. Row 6 on the north side, under the live oak. May I see the plot?" Wally took him. They walked across the cemetery to row 6. Wally pointed at the family plot. There were 6 markers. His mother, Marie Louise Brune, died 1928. His father, Etienne Brune, died 1922. His grandparents on both sides, and 1 great-grandmother. Wally stood at the edge of the plot. Mr. Halloran walked around it slowly. He looked at each marker. He wrote in a small notebook. Then Mr. Halloran said, "Where's yours?" Wally looked at him. "Where's my what?" "Your marker," said Mr. Halloran. "The plot has 7 spaces, but only 6 are used. I assume the 7th is reserved for you." "It is." "I don't see a marker for it, though. No stone, not even a placeholder." Wally said, "That's because I'm not dead yet." Mr. Halloran looked at him. For a long moment he did not say anything. Then he said, very carefully, "Mr. Brune, I have here a record from the parish, from 1928. It lists everyone buried in this plot. There are 7 names. Marie Louise Brune, Etienne Brune, the 4 grandparents, and a 7th name." He turned the paper around. He held it up. He said, "Wallace Etienne Brune, died August 5th, 1928, age 42. Wally stood there. He looked at the paper. His name was there, his full name, his middle name that only his mother had ever used. The date, August 5th, 1928, age 42. His mother had died on August 5th, 1928. Wally had been 42 years old that year. He said, "That's a mistake, sir." Mr. Halloran said gently, "It might be. The parish records are old. Sometimes there are errors. That's part of why I'm here, actually. The estate needs to confirm which members of the family are living and which are not. I've been to the town. I've been to the church. Nobody there knew you by sight. They said, 'Oh, that would be old Wally, out at the cemetery, been there forever, keep to himself.' But nobody could remember the last time they'd talked to you or seen you in town." Wally thought about that. He thought about his trips to town. He went in for groceries every 2 weeks. He talked to the woman at the store. He picked up his pay at the church office on the first Friday of every month. He talked to the priest. He tried to remember the last time. He could not. He tried to remember the priest's face. He could not. He tried to remember the woman at the store. He could see the store. He could see the aisles. He could not see her face. Mr. Halloran was watching him, kindly, patient. "Mr. Brune," said Mr. Halloran, "I don't want to trouble you. I just needed to confirm. If you'll come with me back to the church, we can look at the records together and maybe sort this out." Wally said, "I need to go home first." "Of course." Wally walked home, down the Shell Road, past the cypress swamp, up the steps of his little house on stilts. He went inside. He stood in the front room. He looked around. There was 1 plate on the shelf, 1 fork. One knife, one spoon. The stove was cold. It had been cold, he now realized, for a long time. He had not cooked in a long time. He had thought he had. He had memories of cooking, of red beans, of cornbread, of coffee. But the stove was cold, and the ashes in the woodbox were old and gray, and when he touched them they were the same temperature as the air. He went to the back room. He looked at his bed. The bed was made. The blanket was smooth. He did not think he had made the bed that morning. He did not think he had slept in it the night before. He tried to remember sleeping. He could not remember sleeping. He went to the mirror above the little washstand. He looked at himself. There was nothing in the mirror. Just the room, just the washstand, just the wall behind him. He raised his hand. Nothing raised in the mirror. He stood there a long time. He walked back out to the porch. He sat down in the rocking chair. He rocked. The chair did not creak. He looked out at the bayou. He looked at the water. He looked at the cypress trees. He looked at his hands in his lap. His hands looked like his hands. They had the age spots he remembered. They had the small scar on the knuckle from a shovel handle in 1920. But when he pressed one hand against the other, he did not feel it. He felt a pressure, but it was not the pressure of skin. It was something softer, something more distant, like trying to feel the sun through a window pane. He understood then. He understood the way a man understands something he has known for a very long time and only now allowed himself to see. His mother had come to warn him. Not because the lawyer was dangerous, because the lawyer was going to tell him. He had died on the 5th of August, 1928, at the age of 42. He had died in the same week his mother had died, the same fever, in the same house. He had been buried in the 7th plot in row 6, under the live oak next to her, and afterward, for reasons Wally did not know, for reasons a groundskeeper who had spent 10 years amongst the dead understood in his bones without needing to be told, he had gotten up. He had gotten up and gone back to his house, and he had put on his clothes and eaten his breakfast, or believed he had, and gone to the cemetery and cut the grass and tended the flowers and dug the graves and closed them up. He had done that for 10 years. 10 years of thinking he was living. 10 years of the town looking past him. 10 years of not eating and not sleeping and not seeing himself in the mirror. 10 years of talking to the dead in his head and them talking back, because he was one of them and had not known the frogs sang. The bayou moved slow. Somewhere on the Shell Road, he heard a car door close. Mr. Halloran coming to fetch him. Wally sat in the rocking chair. He looked at his hands. He was not afraid. He was something quieter than afraid. He was tired. He thought about his mother. He thought about the way she had said, "You don't owe him nothing." He understood that now. Mr. Halloran came up the Shell Road. He came up the porch steps. He came to the screen door. He looked through the screen. He said, "Mr. Brune, are you ready?" Wally did not answer. Mr. Halloran opened the screen door. He stepped onto the porch. He looked at the rocking chair. The chair was still. There was no one in it. He looked around the porch. He looked into the house. The house was empty. He called Wally's name. Nothing answered. He walked out to the Shell Road. He walked back to the cemetery. He went to row 6. He stood at the family plot, under the live oak. There were 7 markers now. The 7th marker was old. It was as old as the others. It was weathered gray, the letters worn shallow. But you could still read it if you knew what you were looking for. Wallace Eteen Brune. 1928, aged 42 years. Beloved son, Mr. Halloran stood there a long moment. Then he took off his hat. He held it against his chest. He said quietly, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry I had to be the one." He walked back to his car. He drove away. He never came back to that parish. And the little house on stilts at the end of the Shell Road sat empty. Well, mostly empty. I should tell that part straight. The old fisherman who told me this on the porch outside of Baton Rouge told it careful, and I'll tell it the same way. For about a year after Wally Brune's markers turned up in the family plot, the little house on stilts sat quiet, the way an unclaimed house sits quiet in the bayou country. The paint peeled off the shutters a little more. The wisteria vine on the north side grew a little heavier. A family of raccoons moved in under the porch. A barn owl started nesting in the space between the kitchen ceiling and the roof, and every evening at dusk you could see her go out over the water, low and soft, hunting. The parish did not know what to do with the house. Wally had no will, no known relations, no debts. The bank in the parish seat sent a man out once to look at the property. He looked. He did not go inside. He drove back to town and he wrote a report, and the report went in a drawer, and it stayed there. The cemetery hired a new groundskeeper. His name was Alcide Boudreau. He was 36, married, 4 children. He was a good hand with a mower, and he was a hard worker, and he did not scare easy. He took the job because it paid steady, and the parish was in a bad way after the storms of '37, and steady work was hard to find. He did not want to live in the little house on stilts. His wife would not have stood for it. He lived in town, and he drove out to the cemetery every morning in a rusted-out Model A, and he drove back every evening, and he cut the grass, and he tended the flowers, and he dug the graves, and he closed them up. For about 6 months, he did not go near the little house. Nobody asked him to. The house was not part of the cemetery grounds. It sat on its own quarter-acre down the Shell Road, and it was not his business. But there were nights, Alcides said, when he stayed late at the cemetery to finish a grave, because in Louisiana in August, you sometimes have to bury a body fast, and sometimes the fast has to happen in the evening when the ground is a little cooler. And on those nights, walking back to the Model A at the edge of the cemetery, Alcide would look down the Shell Road toward the little house, and he would see the porch. The porch of Wally Brune's house had 2 rocking chairs on it. On certain nights, both chairs were rocking, slowly, steady, and no sound came off them at all. Not the creak of wood, not the soft groan of a runner on a porch board. Just 2 chairs, moving in the moonlight, the end of the Shell Road, half a mile off, silent as a photograph. Alcide did not mention this to anybody for a long time. He was, as I said, a man who did not scare easy, but he was also a man who had been raised by his grandmother in a bayou parish, and he understood a thing or two about the way the dead sometimes stay near the places they loved. He said a small prayer for Wally every time he saw the chairs rocking, and he got in his Model A and he drove home. One evening in September, he did something he had not done before. He walked down the Shell Road, not all the way, just close enough to see the house clear in the moonlight. Both chairs were rocking. He stood on the road about 100 feet off. He watched. One of the chairs stopped rocking, just the near one. It stopped mid-motion, and it stayed still, as if the person in it had noticed him. Alcide did not move. After a long moment, the chair started rocking again, slow, steady, the same rhythm as before. Alcide walked back to the cemetery. He got in the Model A. He drove home. He did not tell his wife. He did tell his priest some months later. He told the priest during a confession. Not a proper confession, exactly. More a sitting on the church steps in the shade one afternoon, and the priest listened, and the priest said, "Alcide, do you feel afraid when you see them?" Alcide thought about it. He said, "No, Father. It's more like I feel like I ought to say hello." The priest nodded. He said, "Then next time you're passing, say hello. Don't go up on the porch. Don't go in the house. But if you feel you ought to greet 'em, greet 'em. It's a Christian thing to greet the dead, if they're the kind of dead who need greeting." Alcide said all right. He did not know if he would take the priest's advice. But a few nights later, coming back from a late gravedigger's job, he stood at the edge of the cemetery and looked down the shell road, and both chairs were rocking. And Alcide called out, not loud, just loud enough to carry the 100 yards or so on the still bayou air. He called out, "Evening, Mr. Wally. Evening, Miss Marie Louise." He waited. Both chairs stopped rocking at the same time. The porch was still. Then, slowly, both chairs started rocking again. But now they rocked in perfect unison, together, back and forth, like two people nodding at somebody they were glad to see. Alcide took off his hat. He held it against his chest for a moment. He said quietly, "Y'all rest easy." Then he put his hat back on. He got in the Model A. He drove home. He said the chairs rocked and rocked, most nights, for about 7 more years. Then, in the summer of 1945, right around the end of the war, the house on stilts caught fire. Nobody knew how. There had been no storm that night, no lightning, no known cause. The parish thought maybe the barn owl had knocked over something, or maybe kerosene had leaked from an old lamp Wally had left on a shelf. The house burned to the pilings. The pilings stood a long time after, black and charred, out over the water. Alcide, by then in his mid-40s, went out to the site a week after the fire. The ash was cold. The pilings stuck up like broken teeth. The porch was gone. The 2 chairs were gone. Alcide walked around the perimeter of what had been the house, and he prayed, and he went back to the cemetery, and he did not go out there again. But here is the part the old fisherman told me last, and I want to tell it to you, honest, because it is the part I think about most. The old fisherman said that Alcide's youngest son, a boy named Prosper, who had been a small child when the chairs stopped rocking, grew up and became, in his own turn, a groundskeeper at Our Lady of the Waters. He took over the job from his father in 1962. He worked it for 35 years. He was a quiet man. He kept the grass cut. He tended the flowers. He dug the graves. He closed them up. And Prosper, in 1995, told the old fisherman that on certain nights in August, when the moon was up and the water was still, if you stood at the edge of the cemetery and looked down the shell road, you could see, in the moonlight, out over the water where the pilings still stood, 2 shapes, not clear, not solid, just 2 shapes standing side by side on the ghost of a porch that was no longer there, looking out at a bayou that had gone on flowing without them for 57 years. The old fisherman told me all this on the porch outside of Baton Rouge on a hot August night, 40 years after the fire and half a lifetime after Wally Bruin had understood what he was. And when he finished telling it, he sat quiet for a long time, and then he looked at me, and he said, "Old man, you've been writing this all down, but you and me, we've been talking for 2 hours. You had 1 cup of chowder when we started. You still ain't drunk it." I looked at the cup in my hand. The chowder was cold. I had not drunk a drop. The old fisherman said, "You take care of yourself. Here?" I said I would. I put the cup down on the bench between us. I looked at my hand. The bench was empty on the other side. There was no fisherman in there. There had not been, I understood, for some little while. Just a paper cup of cold chowder, sitting where I had set it down, on a bench outside a hardware store on an October evening in a small town in Louisiana. The wind moved a piece of newspaper across the sidewalk. Somewhere a screen door slapped shut. I put my notebook in my coat pocket. I got up. I walked to my truck. I drove home. I did not, that night, look in the mirror. I have not made a habit of it since. I want to tell you, before I let this story go, the reason I kept it in my journal for 40 years, I did not at first understand that I had heard it. I remember writing it down. I remember the pages of my notebook, small notebook, black cover, spiral binding, filling up in my own hand, under the porch light of a boarding house where I was staying outside of Baton Rouge. I remember the old fisherman's voice as I wrote. I remember thinking, I have to get this right. I have to get every word. I remember the crickets in the yard and the moths coming up against the porch screen and the smell of the honeysuckle vine that grew along the rail. I remember, when I finished writing, getting up from the little cane chair and stretching and walking around the porch. I remember looking at the bench where the old fisherman had been sitting. I remember the paper cup of chowder. I remember the cold chowder. I remember not being surprised. Here is the part I did not understand for 40 years. I went inside that night and I climbed the stairs to my room and I lay down on the bed with my clothes on because I was tired. I lay on my back. I looked at the ceiling. The ceiling had a water stain on it in the shape of a bird. I lay there and I thought about the story. I thought about Wally Bruin sitting in his rocking chair on his screened porch, understanding what he was. I lay there a long time. Then I got up. I went to the little washstand in the corner. I looked at myself in the mirror above it. I could see my reflection. I could see my hair, damp from the humidity. I could see my collar and the sweat on my forehead and the tiredness in my eyes. I raised my hand. My reflection raised its hand. Everything was, so far as I could tell, in order. Only, and this is the part I did not, at the time, allow myself to think about, only the hand my reflection raised was not the hand I had raised. I had raised my right hand. My reflection had raised its right hand, of course, but in a mirror, my right hand should have appeared on my reflection's left side. That's how mirrors work. That's how mirrors have always worked. My reflection's raised hand was on its right side, not the mirror right, its own right, same side as mine. I do not know how long I stood there. I know I did not, for a long time, blink. I lowered my hand. My reflection lowered its hand. I turned away from the mirror. I did not check whether it turned away too. I got back into bed. I turned off the light. I lay in the dark until morning. I have told no one this. I have not written it in my journal. I have not looked in mirrors, as I said, much since. I do not know what it means, friend. I have thought about it for 40 years, and I still do not know. Maybe I was tired that night. Maybe I misremembered. Maybe there is a simple thing about mirrors that I do not understand and that a physicist could explain to me in a minute. Or maybe the old fisherman told me a story about himself, and I wrote it down. And somewhere in the telling, the story crossed over. Maybe I sat down that night to write about Wally Brune and the shape at the edge of the porch, and I ended up writing without knowing about myself. Maybe the porch in Baton Rouge was another porch on stilts, and the honeysuckle was another kind of vine, and the man who sat in the cane chair and wrote in a spiral notebook was somebody who had already made his decision a long time back about which side of a mirror he was on. I do not know. I know I am here tonight. I know the fire is warm. I know I have told this to you as honest as I know how. I know, too, that the window behind you is dark, and that if you turn your head, slow, easy, no need to hurry, you might see something in the glass that is not your face. If you do, I would ask you not to be afraid. It is only somebody who has been keeping you going. It is only somebody who has been waiting to say hello. It is only, in the end, a wave. You wave back, friend. That's all you have to do. Wave back, and then close your eyes. The fire's burning low now, friend. The rain hasn't stopped. If you're still with me, close your eyes a moment and let the sound of it carry you. If you drifted off somewhere back in the telling, well, I hope your dreams were kind ones. I'll be right here tomorrow night. Same fire, same chair, same rain on the tin roof. Come back and we'll tell some more. Sleep well now. Sleep deep. Sleep long. Good night, friend.